My name is Thaddeus Galloway. I'm a prison locksmith who survived the first 48 hours of the zombie outbreak. When Gateway Regional Hospital in Denver went into lockdown, I was trapped inside with my tool set and a lifetime of containing dangerous individuals. What I witnessed as the infection spread will haunt me forever. This is how I stayed alive when the dead started walking. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Thaddeus Galloway. I'm a prison locksmith who survived the first 48 hours of the zombie outbreak. When Gateway Regional Hospital in Denver went into lockdown, I was trapped inside with my tool set and a lifetime of containing dangerous individuals. What I witnessed as the infection spread will haunt me forever. This is how I stayed alive when the dead started walking. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I should probably tell you a bit more about myself. For the past 12 years, I've worked as a security systems specialist for the federal prison system. My job involves designing, installing, and maintaining the systems that keep dangerous people contained. Electronic locks, surveillance networks, perimeter security. I know how to build them and how to break them. I know how to keep people in and how to keep people out. Never thought those skills would be the reason I'm still breathing when so many others aren't. The whole thing started 2 days before the outbreak. I received a contract job at Gateway Regional Hospital in Denver. They wanted a security upgrade for several wings, including their isolation units. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Hospitals update their security all the time. Patient privacy, drug storage, standard stuff. I arrived at Gateway on Monday, October 11th, checked in with administration, and got my temporary access badge. First red flag should have been how quickly they processed me. Usually there's paperwork, background checks that take days. They had everything ready like they were expecting me, rushing to get security in place. The hospital administrator who met me, Dr. Winters, seemed on edge, kept checking his phone during our meeting. "We need the East Wing isolation units completed first," he told me. "Priority 1. I asked why the rush. "Routine upgrade," he said, not meeting my eyes. When he walked me through the hospital for the initial assessment, I noticed more security guards than usual for a place this size. Some wore uniforms I didn't recognize. Not hospital security, something else. Military posture, the way they stood, scanned rooms. I know the type from my time working with prison guards. Near the cafeteria, I overheard 2 doctors talking. A woman, I'd later learn was Dr. Eliza Chen, was arguing with another physician. "The containment protocol isn't sufficient," she said. "If this pathogen behaves like the preliminary tests indicate, we need more than just isolation rooms." The other doctor hushed her when he saw me. I pretended not to hear, but those words stuck with me. Containment protocol, pathogen. Not exactly what you want to hear in a place you're about to spend several days working. After the walkthrough, I met Mike Donovan, the hospital's chief of security. Former military, the kind of guy who stands with his back to walls and eyes on exits. He showed me their current systems, pointed out weaknesses. "Whatever you do," he told me, "make sure the isolation ward doors can be remotely locked, all of them, simultaneously if needed." When I asked why, he just said, "Hospital protocol." But his eyes said something else. That night, I went back to my hotel room and looked up Gateway Hospital online. Nothing unusual, except they'd received a significant government grant 3 months prior for infectious disease response readiness. Maybe that explained the upgrades. I grabbed dinner at a diner across from the hotel. The waitress mentioned that they'd been getting a lot of hospital staff coming in, looking stressed the past few days. "Something going around," she said. If she only knew how right she was. I remember checking my phone before bed, scrolling through news. Nothing about disease outbreaks or health alerts in Denver. Whatever was happening, it wasn't public yet. I slept uneasily that night. My room overlooked the hospital parking lot, and twice I woke to the sound of ambulances. Not unusual for a hospital, but still. The next morning, the day everything changed, I arrived at Gateway at 6 in the morning. Wanted to get an early start on the basement security panels before the hospital got busy. The lobby was quiet, but there was a tension in the air. The receptionist had dark circles under her eyes. Security was checking everyone's badges, even staff they clearly recognized. I took the service elevator down to the basement to begin working on the main security hub. That's when I noticed the first truly strange thing. A maintenance worker was taping plastic sheeting over the air vents. When I asked him what he was doing, he just said, "Orders from upstairs." By 8 o'clock, I had the basement panels mapped out and was working my way up to the ground floor. Hospital staff were arriving for the day shift, but something was off. They moved quickly, didn't chat in groups like hospital staff usually do. Everyone looked tired, like they'd been pulling double shifts. I was installing a card reader near the emergency room when I saw the first signs of what was coming. A man in a business suit was being helped in by a woman, probably his wife. He could barely walk, sweating profusely. "He just collapsed at breakfast," she was saying. "His fever spiked so fast." The triage nurse took one look at him and called a code. Not a code blue for cardiac arrest, something else. Within seconds, staff in what looked like hazmat light gear appeared and whisked the man away. The wife tried to follow, but they stopped her. "Ma'am, we need you to stay here. We'll need to examine you too." The fear on her face hit me hard. She knew something was wrong, really wrong, but had no idea what was coming. I continued working, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. Around 9 o'clock, the ambulances started arriving. First one, then 3, then a constant stream. The EMTs wore full hazmat suits. They weren't bringing patients through the main ER entrance either. They were using a side entrance that led directly to the East Wing, the isolation wing I was supposed to be upgrading. I tried calling my boss to ask if he knew what was happening, but couldn't get cell reception. That was the second major red flag. Hospitals have signal boosters specifically, so phones work everywhere. Someone had cut the signal. At 9:30, I ran into Dr. Chen near the cafeteria. She looked exhausted, clutching a coffee like it was keeping her upright. I recognized her from the conversation I'd overheard the day before. "Everything all right, doctor?" I asked. "A lot of ambulances coming in." She studied me for a moment, seemed to recognize my contractor badge. "You're the security specialist," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am, Thaddeus Galloway." "Mr. Galloway," she said quietly, "how quickly can you finish the East Wing security upgrades?" "Day, maybe 2, depending on—" "You have until this evening," she cut me off. "After that, I don't think—" She didn't finish the sentence, just took a deep breath and said, "Prioritize the remote locking systems. Make sure they work even if the main power fails." Before I could ask anything else, her pager went off. She looked at it and her face went pale. "I have to go." As she hurried away, she turned back and said something I'll never forget. "Mr. Galloway, if you have anyone you care about in Denver, tell them to leave the city. Now." I tried to call my sister in Colorado Springs after that, but the cell service was completely dead. The hospital Wi-Fi had been disconnected too. I headed to the security office to use a landline, but Mike Donovan was there, barking orders to his team. "No calls out," he said when he saw me reach for the phone. "Hospital protocol." "What's going on, Mike?" I asked. He glanced at his team, then pulled me aside. "CDC and military are setting up a perimeter, some kind of highly contagious infection. That's all I know." He didn't sound convincing. "People have a right to know if there's a danger," I said. "They're briefing the mayor now. Public announcement soon. But until then, we keep it contained. Focus on your job. We need those isolation locks operational now." A code blue announcement interrupted us. Cardiac arrest. Then another. Then 3 more in quick succession. The overhead speakers were going non-stop. Mike's radio crackled with security alerts from multiple locations. "Get to the East Wing," he ordered me. "Finish what you can. We're locking down in 1 hour." I grabbed my tools and headed toward the isolation ward. Had to pass through the ER to get there. It was chaos. Patients on gurneys lining the hallways, many with the same symptoms: high fever, disorientation, aggressive behavior. The nurses were wearing masks and gloves, but not full protection. They didn't know yet. As I worked on the security panels in the East Wing, hospital staff rushed around me, converting regular rooms into isolation units. I could hear patients screaming in some rooms. Not pain screams, rage screams, the kind I'd heard during prison riots. At 11 o'clock, a hospital-wide announcement ordered all non-essential personnel to report to the auditorium. I considered myself pretty essential, given what Mike had told me, so I kept working. Through the window in the security room, I could see ambulances still arriving, but also military vehicles now, men in uniform unloading equipment. I had just finished installing the master control panel for the East Wing when the hospital PA system crackled to life. Attention all staff and visitors. Gateway Regional Hospital is now under mandatory quarantine by order of the CDC and Department of Defense. No one is permitted to enter or exit the facility until further notice. Please remain calm and follow all staff directions. Quarantine. That word changed everything. I wasn't a contractor anymore. I was a prisoner. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my career building systems to keep people contained, and now I was caught in one. The floor nurse at the station near me, Sandra, dropped the chart she was holding. "They can't do that," she whispered. "My kids, they're at school. I need to get to my kids." Before I could respond, the doors at the end of the hall burst open. A patient, a man in his 30s, stumbled through. He was dressed in a hospital gown, soaked with sweat and something darker. Blood. His movements were wrong, jerky. His eyes were clouded over, like cataracts, but worse. 2 security guards chased after him. "Sir, you need to return to your room." The man turned toward them and let out a sound I still hear in my nightmares. Not a scream, not a growl, something primal that didn't belong in a human throat. He charged at the first guard, moving faster than someone in his condition should be able to move. What happened next is when I knew the world had changed forever. The man tackled the guard and bit into his neck. Not a panic bite, not a fight bite. He was feeding. Blood sprayed across the white hospital walls. The second guard tried to pull him off, but the patient was unnaturally strong, frenzied. Sandra screamed and hit the emergency button. Alarms blared throughout the wing. I stood frozen, my locksmith tools in hand, watching as more security personnel flooded the hallway. They managed to subdue the patient, but the injured guard was bleeding out fast. As they carried both men away, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The bitten guard's skin was already taking on a grayish tinge, his eyes rolling back. The change was happening already. That's when the hospital truly began to descend into chaos, and I was trapped right in the middle of it. By noon, the hospital had completely transformed. Guards were posted at every exit. Some hospital staff tried to leave. A young resident doctor argued that he lived alone, posed no contamination risk. They restrained him. That's when everyone realized this wasn't a negotiation. I kept working on the security systems, figuring it was better to stay busy and useful. Plus, my tools gave me an excuse to move around when others couldn't. I remember thinking that if things got bad, I'd rather know the layout and which doors I could open. The hospital cafeteria had been converted to a staff briefing area. I slipped in, keeping to the back wall. Dr. Winters was addressing about 50 staff members, mostly doctors and senior nurses. "What we're dealing with," he said, "is a highly aggressive pathogen. It appears to be bloodborne, primarily transmitted through bites or direct fluid contact. Symptoms progress rapidly: fever, disorientation, aggression, then a brief period of what appears to be death before." He paused, struggling with his next words. "Before reanimation of the host body with complete loss of cognitive function, except for base aggression and feeding impulses." The room erupted in voices. A surgeon near me said what everyone was thinking. "You're describing zombies. This is insane." Dr. Winters didn't correct him. That silence confirmed it more than words could have. The CDC has named it acute necrotizing encephalopathy with reanimation syndrome, he continued. "We've been designated as a primary containment and research facility. Military support is establishing a perimeter, but for now, our job is to maintain isolation protocols and assist Dr. Chen's team in collecting data that might lead to treatment." A nurse stood up. "What about our families? We need to warn them. All external communications are being managed by the CDC. A public alert is being prepared, but they're trying to prevent panic. For now, I need everyone to focus on their duties. We have patients, regular patients, who still need care." After the briefing, I ran into Mike Donovan again. He looked like he'd aged 10 years since morning. "How are we looking with those security upgrades?" he asked. "East Wing is done, working on the main hospital corridors now." He lowered his voice. "Listen, I've got a job for you. CDC teams set up a research lab on the 4th floor. They need additional security measures, keypad locks on the inner doors, separate from the main system. In case the main system fails, I said, understanding immediately. Exactly. If everything goes to hell, we need to make sure that lab stays secure. Whatever they're working on in there might be our only shot. I nodded. I'll need access. He handed me a key card with CDC clearance. Direct from the top. Don't make me regret this. The fourth floor was eerily quiet compared to the chaos below. Armed guards, military not hospital security, stood outside the converted lab. They checked my clearance twice before letting me in. Inside, a team of about 10 people in various levels of protective gear worked at stations. Dr. Chen was there, examining samples through a microscope. She looked up when I entered. Mr. Galloway. Good. She gestured me over. We need additional security on these doors and the specimen storage. She walked me through the lab, pointing out where she wanted new locks installed. As I worked, I could hear the scientists talking. They weren't making much effort to censor themselves around me. Either they were too focused, or they figured it didn't matter anymore. The cellular modification is unlike anything I've seen, one was saying. It's almost like the pathogen is rewriting the host DNA in real time. Reanimation times are decreasing, another reported. First cases took nearly 6 hours from death to reanimation. New cases are taking less than 30 minutes. Dr. Chen was reviewing data on a computer. We need to understand why some people turn faster than others. There must be a genetic component. While installing a keypad lock, I couldn't help asking her, is there any treatment? Any way to stop it once someone's infected? She looked at me for a long moment. Not yet. Once the pathogen enters the bloodstream, infection progression appears unstoppable with current methods. She lowered her voice. But between you and me, I think there's something about the initial immune response that might give us a clue. Some patients fight it off longer than others. As I finished up, Dr. Chen pulled me aside. The locks you're installing, make sure I have the override codes, just me. Dr. Winters told me all senior staff should have access, I said. Mr. Galloway, if this gets as bad as I think it might, the chain of command could break down quickly. I need to ensure these samples remain secure, regardless of what happens outside this lab. The intensity in her eyes convinced me. I gave her the override codes, programming them directly into the system. That decision would later save my life. By 2 p.m, the hospital's atmosphere had changed again. There was less movement in the hallways. Patients had either been evacuated from non-essential areas or consolidated into secure wings. The infected were all in isolation, but rumors were spreading about how many there were now. Dozens, maybe more. I was replacing a lock mechanism on a fire exit when I heard shouting. A group of visitors was confronting security in the main lobby, demanding to be let out. I moved closer to listen. My wife just came in for a routine checkup, one man was yelling. We don't have this virus thing. You can't keep us here. The security guard stood firm. Sir, we understand your frustration, but the quarantine applies to everyone. It's for your protection and the protection of the public. Protection? My kids are home alone. Who's protecting them? The situation was escalating. I saw Mike signal to his team, who moved into position. They were prepared to use force if necessary. These weren't hospital security anymore. These were containment officers with a mission. I slipped away, not wanting to get caught in whatever was about to happen. As I rounded the corner, the emergency alert system blared. Another code, another infected patient breaking containment. This was happening with increasing frequency now. The isolation systems couldn't handle the patient load, and the infected seemed to grow stronger and more aggressive as the disease progressed. Around 3 o'clock, I finished the lab security and moved on to the West Wing, where they'd relocated the non-infected patients. A doctor named Harrison was coordinating the movement of critical care patients. You're the locksmith, right? He asked when he saw me working on a door. Security specialist, I corrected him. Whatever. Listen, we've got immunocompromised patients here. Can you set up these doors to only open with authorized access? No exceptions? I nodded and got to work. As I was programming the lock controllers, Harrison received an update that made him go pale. They've lost control of the East Wing second floor, he told a nearby nurse. 3 staff infected. They're sealing it off completely. The nurse gasped. There are patients still in there, and Dr. Myers was doing rounds. Harrison's face hardened. Then they're already lost. Focus on who we can save. That cold calculation shocked me at the time. Within 12 hours, I'd be making the same kind of decisions. The hospital PA system crackled to life again. Attention all personnel. Initiate Containment Protocol Delta. Repeat, Containment Protocol Delta is now in effect. I didn't know what that meant, but the staff did. They moved with new urgency, securing doors, moving patients, gathering supplies. I asked a nurse what Protocol Delta meant. She just shook her head. It means they don't think they can contain it anymore. It means we're on our own. The phone at the nurse's station rang, an actual landline. The nurse answered, listened, then hung up with shaking hands. They're saying the city emergency services are overwhelmed. Similar outbreaks all over Denver. The National Guard is setting up blockades on major highways. That was the moment I truly understood this wasn't just a hospital problem. Whatever this was, it had already spread beyond these walls. The quarantine wasn't just to keep us in. It was already too late for that. It was to keep others out. I moved quickly to finish the West Wing security upgrades. As I worked, I kept my eyes and ears open. Staff were using landlines to call different departments, sharing information that wasn't coming through official channels. I pieced together a frightening picture. The infection was spreading exponentially. Hospitals across the city were reporting similar cases. The CDC was scrambling to establish containment zones, but they were already behind the curve. Around 4 in the afternoon, the hospital experienced its first major power fluctuation. The lights dimmed, computers rebooted, and for a heart-stopping moment, the electronic locks disengaged before the backup generators kicked in. It was brief, maybe 10 seconds, but that was long enough. Alarms blared from 3 different areas where infected patients had been secured. They were learning, somehow. They waited for weakness in the system, then exploited it. I ran to the security office where Mike Donovan was coordinating response teams. "We need manual locks as backups," I told him. "The electronic systems won't hold if the power keeps fluctuating." He nodded grimly. "Do what you can. Prioritize the research lab and the West Wing patient areas." He showed me the security camera feeds. In one, I could see infected patients. I still couldn't think of them as zombies, struggling against door barriers. Their coordination was decreasing, but their strength and aggression were increasing. "How many infected do we have now?" I asked. "Too many," he said simply. "And it's getting worse. When they turn, they attack. When they attack, they create more infected. It's exponential." As I gathered my tools to implement manual lock overrides, Mike put a hand on my shoulder. "Thaddeus, right? Listen, Thaddeus. The military is establishing a secure extraction point for essential personnel at 7 tonight. CDC researchers, key medical staff. I can add you to the list. We need someone with your skills at the containment centers they're setting up." It was tempting, a way out of this nightmare, but something felt wrong about the offer. "What about everyone else?" I asked. Mike's expression told me everything. "The quarantine remains in effect. Until we understand containment better, the risk is too high." "So everyone else just stays here, with the infected?" "Those are the orders." He looked away. "Think about it. Let me know by 6. I left without answering, a heavy feeling in my gut. The idea of abandoning hundreds of people to save myself didn't sit right. But neither did staying in a hospital rapidly filling with the infected. As I worked on installing manual locks on critical doors, I couldn't help noticing the changes in hospital staff. Some moved with determined purpose, focusing entirely on their patients. Others were clearly looking for ways out, preparing for self-preservation. The cohesive medical team from this morning was fracturing under pressure. By 5 o'clock, the situation outside was deteriorating too. Through windows, I could see military vehicles establishing perimeters, but I also saw smoke rising from different parts of the city, heard distant sirens. The infection wasn't contained to Gateway Hospital. It was everywhere. I was installing a lock on a supply room when Dr. Chen found me again. She looked ragged, her lab coat stained with what I hoped was coffee. "Mr. Galloway, I need your help," she said, her voice low and urgent. "The data we've collected, it needs to be secured, and I don't just mean locked up." "What do you need?" "I've loaded critical research onto an encrypted drive. If something happens to me, I need to know it will reach the CDC command center." She pressed a small hard drive into my hand. "The encryption key is Osiris Protocol. Remember that?" "Osiris? Like the Egyptian god of the dead?" I couldn't help asking. A grim smile crossed her face. "Appropriate, isn't it? This drive contains everything we've learned about the pathogen, including promising treatment directions. It could be the difference between containing this and losing everything. Before I could ask more questions, her pager beeped. She checked it and swore under her breath. I have to go. 3 more staff just showed symptoms. Keep that drive safe, Thaddeus. And get yourself on that extraction if you can. She hurried away, leaving me holding what might be humanity's best hope. I tucked the drive securely in my inner pocket and continued working. Around 5:30, I finished installing manual locks on the most critical areas. As I was heading back to check on the West Wing, the hospital experienced another power fluctuation, longer this time. The backup generators struggled to kick in, and for nearly 30 seconds, the hospital was in darkness. When the lights came back on, the alarm systems were blaring from multiple sectors. The electronic locks had failed again, and this time, the infected had broken through in several areas. The PA system came alive with a different voice: military, authoritative. All non-essential personnel proceed immediately to designated safe zones. Security teams to containment breach points. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. I could hear screaming now, real human screaming, from the direction of the East Wing. The infected were no longer contained. That's when I knew. The hospital was falling, and we were all falling with it. I made my way toward the security office, figuring Mike would have the best grasp of the situation. The corridors were becoming more chaotic by the minute. Hospital staff rushed past me, some helping patients, others clearly just trying to find safety. The overhead announcements continued, but the calm, professional tone had been replaced with urgency. When I reached the security office, I found it transformed into a command center. Military personnel had joined the hospital's security team. Maps of the hospital were spread across tables with areas marked in red. Containment breaches. Mike stood in the center, coordinating response teams via radio. East Wing 3rd floor is compromised, someone reported. At least 8 infected loose in the hallways. We need backup. Mike saw me enter and waved me over. Status on those manual locks? Critical areas secured, I told him. Research lab, West Wing patient floors, pharmacy. He nodded. Good. Situation's deteriorating faster than anticipated. The extraction timeline has been moved up. 6 o'clock at the helipad. Be there if you want out. I glanced at the security monitors. Camera feeds showed infected patients staggering through hallways, some attacking staff or other patients. Security teams were trying to contain them, but they were spread too thin. For every infected they subdued, 2 more appeared. How many infected are we dealing with now? I asked. A military officer answered, current estimate is 60 plus and growing. The infection rate is accelerating. Once bitten, victims are turning in under an hour now. Mike pointed to the monitors. We've lost the entire East Wing. Current strategy is to create a buffer zone around the West Wing and Central Hospital to protect remaining patients and essential personnel. I watched the screens, transfixed by the horror unfolding. In one feed, an infected doctor, still wearing a white coat, cornered a nurse. She fought back with a fire extinguisher, but the infected was unnaturally strong. Security arrived just as the infected sank teeth into her arm. They pulled it off, but it was already too late for her. They retained some basic intelligence, the military officer noted clinically. They remember doors, basic tool use in early stages. But it degrades over time until they are operating on pure instinct, attack and feed. I tore my eyes away from the screens. The research lab, is it secure? For now, Mike said. CDC team is evacuating with the first extraction. They're gathering final samples. I thought of Dr. Chen and the hard drive she'd given me. I should check the lab security before extraction. Mike nodded. Be careful. Use the service corridors. Main hallways are increasingly compromised. I grabbed a radio from the equipment table. I'll report in when I reach the lab. As I turned to leave, Mike caught my arm. Thaddeus, if you encounter infected, don't engage. They're stronger than they look. Run, hide, barricade. Understand? I nodded and left, the weight of the hard drive heavy in my pocket. The service corridors were utility passages used by maintenance staff. Narrow, dimly lit, but largely empty. I moved quickly but cautiously, listening for any sounds that didn't belong. My locksmith tools doubled as potential weapons, heavy metal implements that could buy me time if needed. I reached the central stairwell and began climbing to the fourth floor where the research lab was located. The stairs were concrete, emergency lighting casting long shadows. I heard noises echoing in the stairwell, distant shouting, running footsteps, the occasional alarm. But no infected, at least not yet. Reaching the fourth floor, I carefully opened the door and peered out. The hallway was clear but showed signs of recent chaos. An overturned gurney, scattered papers, a smear of blood on one wall. I moved toward the lab, staying close to the wall. The lab's outer doors were secure, the keypad lock still operational. I punched in the code doctor Chen had given me and slipped inside. The lab was in disarray. Equipment was being packed hastily into cases. Only 3 researchers remained, including Dr. Chen. She looked up when I entered, relief crossing her face. "Thaddeus." "Good. We're almost finished here." I moved to her workstation. "I came to check the security before extraction. Is everything holding?" She nodded, continuing to pack specimen containers into a biohazard case. "So far. We've got about 20 minutes before the helicopter arrives." She lowered her voice. "Did you secure the drive?" I patted my pocket. "Safe. Is there anything else I should take?" She glanced at her colleagues, then led me to a small refrigeration unit. "These samples, they're from patients who showed unusual resistance to the infection. Their genetic profiles might be key to developing treatment." She handed me a small insulated container. "Can you get this to the extraction point?" I took the container. "Of course." A crash from somewhere outside the lab made everyone freeze. Dr. Chen moved to a computer station and brought up the hallway security feed. The image showed 3 infected hospital staff breaking through a barricade at the far end of the corridor. "They're coming this way," one of the other researchers said, voice rising in panic. Dr. Chen turned to me. "The inner lab has a reinforced door. We can secure ourselves until extraction." We quickly moved equipment into the inner lab. As I helped Dr. Chen carry a case of research materials, I asked the question that had been bothering me. "Dr. Chen, how did this happen? How did the infection spread so fast?" She paused, weighing her words carefully. "It didn't just start today. The first cases appeared 3 days ago, brought to different hospitals across the city. By the time we realized we were dealing with the same pathogen, it had already established multiple infection vectors." She looked troubled. "What's strange is the simultaneous emergence in different locations with no clear patient zero." "You're saying it was deliberate?" I asked, shocked. "I'm saying we don't know enough yet, which is why this research is so important." A banging sound came from the outer lab doors. The infected had reached us. I quickly ushered everyone into the inner lab and secured the reinforced door. Through the small window, we could see the outer lab doors beginning to buckle under the assault. "Those doors won't hold for long," I said. "Is there another way out?" Dr. Chen pointed to an emergency exit at the back of the inner lab. "It leads to a maintenance corridor that connects to the main stairwell, but it's only meant for fire evacuation. Once opened, it triggers an alarm and can't be secured again." I checked my watch. Still 30 minutes until extraction. "We need to hold this position as long as possible. If we open that emergency exit too soon, we might just create another entry point for the infected." The outer lab doors finally gave way. We watched through the inner lab window as infected hospital staff, some still wearing scrubs and lab coats, stumbled into the lab. They seemed disoriented at first. Then one noticed us through the window. It let out that same inhuman sound I'd heard earlier and began pounding on our door. Dr. Chen stepped back from the window. "The good news is they don't seem capable of complex problem solving. They can't operate the keypad lock." "The bad news is they don't get tired," I observed, as more infected joined the first, pounding relentlessly on the door. We gathered what critical research materials we could carry. Dr. Chen distributed sample cases among the team. "Remember, these samples are priority 1. Get them to the extraction point at all costs." The reinforced door was holding, but the infected were growing more frenzied, their pounding more coordinated. Small cracks were appearing at the door frame. "We need to move," I said. "That door won't hold much longer." Dr. Chen nodded grimly and moved to the emergency exit. "Once I open this, the alarm will sound. We'll need to move quickly and stay together." She pushed the emergency bar. An alarm blared immediately, and the door swung open to reveal a narrow utility corridor. We filed through quickly. I took up the rear position, closing the door behind us as firmly as possible, though it wouldn't lock. The utility corridor was narrow and poorly lit. We moved in single file, Doctor, Chen leading the way. I could hear the infected behind us, drawn by the alarm, pushing through the emergency exit we'd used. Faster, I urged, hearing them gaining on us. We reached a junction where the corridor split. Dr. Chen hesitated. Left leads to the main stairwell. Right goes to the service elevator. Stairwell, I decided quickly. Elevators are too risky with power fluctuations. We turned left and continued at a near run. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. The infected moved awkwardly but with surprising speed, driven by whatever hunger drove them. The door to the stairwell appeared ahead, a heavy fire door that could be secured. We rushed through, and I slammed it shut behind us, using a screwdriver from my tool belt to jam the push bar mechanism. That won't hold them long, I warned, but it'll slow them down. We need to get to the roof. We began climbing the stairs, the exertion showing on everyone's faces. Dr. Chen, carrying a heavy case of samples, was struggling to keep pace. "Here, let me," I said, taking the case from her. Now burdened with both her case and the insulated container she'd given me earlier, I felt the weight slowing me down, too. We had climbed one flight when we heard the stairwell door below us give way. The infected had broken through sooner than I'd expected. "Keep moving," Dr. Chen urged. "2 more floors to the roof." The extraction point was on the helipad, located on the hospital's roof. We continued climbing, hearing the infected behind us. Their movements on the stairs were clumsy but persistent. They wouldn't stop until they caught us or we reached safety. As we climbed, I noticed Dr. Chen checking her watch repeatedly. "Something wrong?" I asked between breaths. "Extraction was scheduled for 6, she said. "But with the situation deteriorating, they might leave earlier. We need to hurry." We pushed ourselves harder, the weight of our precious cargo making each step an effort. Behind us, the first of the infected appeared on the stairs below. They moved awkwardly on the steps, but kept coming. Reaching the final landing, we found the roof access door. Dr. Chen punched a code into the keypad, but nothing happened. "Power's out in this section," she realized. "The electronic lock isn't working." I moved forward, setting down the cases. "Let me." From my tool belt, I selected a tension wrench and pick. The roof access had a mechanical lock backup, standard for emergency exits. I inserted my tools and worked the mechanism, feeling the familiar resistance of pins aligning. The infected were getting closer, just 1 flight below us now. I could hear their rasping breaths, their uncoordinated footsteps on the stairs. "Hurry!" one of the researchers pleaded. I blocked out everything but the lock, feeling for that perfect moment when all pins aligned. There, the cylinder turned. I pushed the door open, and bright evening light flooded the stairwell. We spilled onto the roof, and I quickly secured the door behind us, using my screwdriver to jam the latch. The roof was large and flat, with the helipad marked at the center. In the distance, I could see smoke rising from different parts of Denver. The city was already falling apart. But there was no helicopter waiting for us. "Where's the extraction team?" one researcher asked, panic evident in his voice. Dr. Chen checked her watch again. "We're early. Should be here in about 10 minutes. I scanned the roof, looking for defensive positions. "We need to secure this area until they arrive." The roof had little in the way of cover, some ventilation equipment, a small maintenance shed. I directed everyone to gather near the helipad, keeping the sample cases secure. "What if they don't come?" the panicked researcher asked. "They'll come, Doctor," Chen assured him, though I caught the uncertainty in her eyes. I moved to the roof edge and looked down at the hospital grounds. Military vehicles were still present, but there was obvious chaos. I could see infected individuals in the parking lot, attacking anyone they could reach. Gunfire erupted occasionally as soldiers tried to maintain the perimeter. The city beyond looked worse. Smoke rose from multiple locations. I could hear distant sirens and what might have been gunfire or explosions. Whatever containment measures had been implemented were clearly failing. A banging sound drew my attention back to the roof access door. The infected had reached it and were pounding against the barrier. The door was holding for now, but like every other barrier in this hospital, it wouldn't last forever. "We've got company," I warned, returning to the group. Dr. Chen looked grim. "If that door gives before extraction arrives..." We all knew what that meant, trapped on the roof with nowhere to run. I searched the maintenance shed and found some tools, a wrench, pipes, a hammer. Not much, but better than nothing. I distributed them among the group. If they break through, stay together. Keep them at bay long enough for extraction to arrive. The minutes ticked by, agonizingly slowly. The pounding on the door grew more intense. Small cracks appeared at the frame, the same pattern I'd seen with the lab door. These infected might not be able to problem solve, but their persistence and strength made them formidable nonetheless. "Where's that helicopter?" the panicked researcher demanded, clutching his pipe weapon with white knuckles. I checked my watch. 6 o'clock had come and gone. The extraction was late. Dr. Chen moved to my side. "Something's wrong. They should be here by now." I nodded grimly. "We need a backup plan." The roof access door was starting to give way, the frame splintering under relentless assault. We backed toward the helipad, forming a defensive circle around the precious research materials. That's when we heard it. The distant thump of helicopter rotors. Relief washed over everyone's faces as a military helicopter appeared over the Denver skyline, heading straight for us. "They're coming!" The mood shifted instantly from despair to hope. The helicopter approached rapidly, its downdraft whipping across the roof as it prepared to land. At that moment, the roof access door finally gave way. Infected hospital staff spilled onto the roof, immediately spotting us by the helipad. "Hold them off!" I shouted over the roar of the approaching helicopter. "Just for a minute more!" The infected charged toward us, moving in that unnervingly fast shamble. There were at least 10 of them, former doctors and nurses now transformed into something inhuman. Our small group backed against the helipad marking, makeshift weapons raised. The helicopter was descending now, just seconds from touchdown. The first infected reached us, a former security guard, his uniform stained with blood. I swung the heavy wrench I'd found, connecting with its head. It staggered but didn't fall. These things were incredibly resilient. Dr. Chen jabbed at another with a pipe, keeping it at bay while the helicopter touched down. Military personnel in full tactical gear jumped out, weapons raised. "Move! Move!" they shouted, laying down covering fire as we rushed toward the helicopter. The infected kept coming, despite the gunfire, driven by whatever primal hunger controlled them now. I helped Dr. Chen aboard, passing up the sample cases. The military team provided covering fire, dropping infected with headshots. The only reliable way to stop them, I realized. As I climbed aboard, I looked back at the chaos on the roof. More infected were pouring through the access door. The military team was retreating to the helicopter, still firing controlled bursts. The last soldier jumped aboard, shouting, "Clear!" to the pilot. The helicopter lifted immediately, banking away from the hospital roof, now swarming with infected. We'd made it out. But looking down at Denver as we gained altitude, I could see that our escape was just the beginning of a much larger nightmare. The city below was descending into chaos, and from what Dr. Chen had said, this was happening across the country, maybe even the world. I clutched the hard drive and sample container, wondering if they really did contain the key to stopping this. And I wondered how many others hadn't been lucky enough to make it to an extraction point. What I didn't know then was that our helicopter wasn't bound for safety at all. We were flying straight into the heart of the storm, and my skills as a prison locksmith were about to become more valuable than I could have imagined. I was assigned to a security team headed by a Lieutenant Parker, a tightly wound woman with sharp eyes and faster reflexes. We loaded into an armored transport vehicle with a military escort, 2 Humvees, one in front, one behind. Our mission was to assess a potential evacuation route from a residential area that had been designated as a yellow zone, meaning partial infection, but not completely overrun. Our intel is about 6 hours old, Lieutenant Parker briefed us as we rolled through the military checkpoint. Situation may have deteriorated since then. Keep your eyes open and stay close. The moment we left the green zone perimeter, the reality of what had happened to Denver hit me full force. The city I had visited countless times for work was transformed. Abandoned cars littered the streets. Some buildings showed fire damage. Others had broken windows, signs of looting or desperate entry. Occasionally we saw bodies, some obviously dead. Others moving in that distinctive shambling way that meant they'd turned. Most disturbing was the silence. Denver should have been alive with morning traffic, people heading to work, kids going to school. Instead, it felt like driving through a ghost town, punctuated only by distant sounds of chaos, an occasional gunshot, breaking glass, a scream. Our route took us through what had been a commercial district. Storefronts were smashed, merchandise scattered across sidewalks. The military had established checkpoints at major intersections, but many looked understaffed, the soldiers tense and jumpy. "They're spread too thin," I observed to Lieutenant Parker. She nodded grimly. National Guard was deployed too late. By the time they mobilized, infection had already taken key infrastructure. Now they're playing catch-up. We turned onto a residential street lined with apartment buildings. Here, there were signs of hasty evacuation, doors left open, personal belongings dropped in driveways. And more infected, wandering aimlessly until they spotted our vehicles. Then they'd change, becoming focused predators, running toward us with that unnatural speed. The military escort didn't hesitate to eliminate any infected that approached too closely. I watched through the armored window as they dropped with headshots. It was coldly efficient, necessary, but still shocking to witness. Infection rate in this sector was estimated at 30% as of last night, Lieutenant Parker said, checking her tablet. Likely higher now. We need to assess whether evacuation is still viable or if this area should be reclassified as a red zone. Red zone, meaning abandoned to the infected. Written off completely. We reached our target location, a school that had been designated as an evacuation center. The building was large, with multiple exits and a fenced perimeter. Strategically sound, except for one major problem. It was already occupied, not by the infected, but by survivors. As our vehicles approached, people appeared at windows and doorways. Civilians who had sought shelter in the substantial building. From the looks of it, at least 100 people had barricaded themselves inside. Lieutenant Parker frowned. Intel didn't mention civilian occupation. We parked in the school's circular drive, and the military escort established a perimeter. Lieutenant Parker, myself, and 2 other security specialists exited the vehicle to assess the situation. A man emerged from the main entrance, flanked by others who were clearly keeping watch. He appeared to be in his 50s, with the bearing of someone used to authority, maybe the school principal. "Are you from the National Guard?" he called out. "We've been waiting for evacuation for nearly 24 hours. Lieutenant Parker stepped forward. "Sir, I'm Lieutenant Parker. We're conducting an assessment for potential evacuation routes. This location was not listed as an active shelter." The man looked incredulous. "We've been calling emergency services since yesterday morning. We have families here, children, elderly. Some need medical attention." I scanned the building, my security instincts kicking in. The survivors had done a decent job barricading the ground floor windows and securing entrances. But I could also see weaknesses, areas where a determined infected could eventually break through. "How many people do you have inside?" I asked. 147 at last count," the man replied. "Most from the surrounding neighborhood. We've been pooling supplies, taking turns on watch." Lieutenant Parker pulled our team aside. "This complicates things. The evacuation route was planned for official rescue teams, not civilian self-evacuation. We can't just leave them," I said. "Look at their barricades. They're adequate now, but they won't hold if a larger group of infected attacks." Parker checked her tablet again, communicating with command. After a tense minute, she cursed under her breath. "Command says civilian evacuation isn't authorized yet. They're telling us to mark the location and continue our route assessment." "They're right there," I said, gesturing to the school. "Living, breathing people who need help now." "Orders are to assess and report, not to extract," Parker replied, though I could see the conflict in her eyes. "They'll be included in evacuation plans once the route is secured." But I'd seen enough of the city to know that might be too late. The infection was spreading faster than the military could respond. By the time an official evacuation was organized, this yellow zone could easily be a red zone. I made a decision that would alter my path completely. "Let me stay," I said. "I can help them strengthen their defenses until evacuation arrives. The rest of you continue the route assessment." Parker stared at me. "That's not protocol." "I'm a civilian consultant, not military," I reminded her. "My expertise is in securing perimeters. These people need that right now more than the assessment team does. Drop me here, pick me up on your way back." She hesitated, then nodded sharply. "Your call, but I'm noting this was your decision, against recommendation." I gathered some basic supplies from our vehicle, a radio, water, a first aid kit. Before I disembarked, Parker pulled me aside. If we can't get back to you for some reason, the fallback extraction point is marked on this map. She handed me a folded paper with routes marked in different colors. Get there by tomorrow morning if you need extraction. I nodded, understanding the subtext. She was giving me an out if things went bad. I'll be here. Get these people on the priority evacuation list. The man who'd greeted us, who introduced himself as Daniel Cooper, the school's vice principal, was grateful for the assistance. As the military vehicles pulled away, he led me inside the makeshift shelter. The scene within was both heartening and disturbing. The survivors had organized themselves remarkably well. Classrooms had been converted to living quarters, with families staying together. A cafeteria served as both dining hall and medical area. People had assigned roles: security teams, food distribution, medical care with a few healthcare workers present. But resources were clearly strained. Food was being carefully rationed. Medical supplies were limited, and fear hung in the air, especially among the children who stayed close to parents or caregivers. We've been trying to keep spirits up, Daniel told me as he showed me their security setup. Having some structure helps, especially for the kids. But people are scared. They've seen what's happening out there. They know what those things do to people. I spent the next few hours doing what I do best, assessing and strengthening security measures. I showed them how to create more effective barricades using available materials, how to reinforce weak points in doors and windows, how to create safe zones within the building that could be sealed off if the perimeter was breached. They had weapons, a few legal firearms, plus improvised weapons like baseball bats and kitchen knives. I helped organize their security teams into shifts, establishing patrol routes and communication protocols. While working with a team securing a side entrance, I struck up a conversation with a woman named Sarah, a nurse who was heading the makeshift medical station. "How bad is it out there, really?" she asked as we reinforced a door frame. "We've only gotten glimpses, and the cell networks went down, so we lost contact with the outside world." I considered softening the truth, then decided these people needed honesty more than comfort. It's spreading faster than containment efforts can handle. The military is establishing safe zones, but they're limited in size and resources. "And the rest of us?" she pressed. "What happens to everyone who doesn't make it to a safe zone?" I remembered the briefing, 20% capacity. They're prioritizing essential personnel and infrastructure. Everyone else... I didn't finish the sentence. Sarah's expression hardened. "So we could be waiting for evacuation that never comes." "That's why I stayed," I told her, "to make sure you're not forgotten." By late afternoon, we had significantly improved the school's defenses. I used the radio to check in with Lieutenant Parker's team. They were completing their route assessment and would return within a few hours. I reported the shelter's status and emphasized the need for evacuation resources. But as darkness approached, something changed outside. The infected, who had been relatively scattered during daylight hours, began to congregate. It started with just a few shambling figures drawn perhaps by the sounds and movements from the school. But they attracted others, and soon a dozen infected were outside the perimeter fence. "They hunt more actively at night," Daniel observed as we watched from an upstairs window. "We've noticed the pattern over the past day." More concerning was how they behaved. During my time at Gateway Hospital, the infected had seemed almost random in their movements. These were different, more coordinated somehow, as if responding to some shared impulse. They began testing the fence, pushing against weak points, almost probing for entry. "They're learning," I said, the realization chilling me. "Or evolving. These aren't mindless anymore." One of the security team members, a former police officer named Marcus, joined us at the window. "It's like they can smell us. The longer this goes on, the smarter they get." I radioed Lieutenant Parker again with an update. The response was not what I hoped for. "Command is diverting all evacuation resources to the downtown sector," her voice crackled through the radio. "A major containment barrier failed. They're pulling our team to assist." "What about extraction?" I asked. "There are almost 150 civilians here who need evacuation." A pause. "Negative on immediate extraction? Fall back to Plan B if situation deteriorates. I'll try to get you on tomorrow's priority list." Plan B, the extraction point on the map, meaning these people were on their own unless I could get them to the fallback point. I didn't share this information with everyone, only with Daniel and a few of the security team leaders. We need to prepare for the possibility that official evacuation won't reach us tonight, I told them. Daniel took it stoically. We've been self-sufficient this long. One more night isn't going to break us. But I wasn't so sure. The growing group of infected outside concerned me. By nightfall, there were at least 30 testing the perimeter fence and more arriving hourly. Our improved defenses would hold against individuals or small groups, but a concentrated mass of infected was another matter entirely. I used my locksmith skills to create fallback positions within the school, strategic doors that could be quickly secured to isolate sections if necessary. We established a central safe zone in the school gymnasium with multiple layers of security between it and the outside world. Around 8 in the evening, I used Dr. Chen's modified communication device, hoping she might have information or resources I couldn't access through official channels. Dr. Chen, it's Thaddeus. I'm at a civilian shelter in the Northwest residential sector. Over 140 civilians, including children and elderly. Official evacuation has been diverted. Do you have any contacts who might help? Her reply came swiftly, her voice tense. Thaddeus, the situation at command is deteriorating. Multiple containment failures across the city. Military is pulling back to defend green zones only. No auxiliary evacuations authorized. My heart sank. These people won't survive if the infected breach their perimeter. They're already gathering outside in numbers. That matches what we're seeing in other sectors, she replied. The infected are showing coordinated behaviors after nightfall, communal hunting patterns. Any solutions from your research? Anything that might help us? A pause. We've identified a potential weakness. The infected appear to rely heavily on sound and movement for targeting. Visual acuity seems compromised, especially in early stage turned. If you need to move people, minimize noise and proceed slowly. It wasn't much, but it was something. What about the research on resistant individuals? Any progress? Some. We've isolated a genetic marker that correlates with delayed turning. About 10% of the population carries it. When infected, they remain lucid longer, turn more slowly. But they still turn eventually. Unless she found a treatment. That was the unspoken hope we were all clinging to. I need to go, she said suddenly. Something's happening in the lab. Be careful, Thaddeus, and watch for unusual military movements. There's something they're not telling us about Phase 2. The communication ended, leaving me with decisions to make. The growing horde outside, the unlikelihood of official evacuation, the potential extraction point that might or might not still be viable by morning. I rejoined Daniel and the security team. We need a contingency plan, I told them. If the perimeter is breached during the night, we need a way to get everyone to a secondary location. We spread maps of the surrounding area on a table. The fallback extraction point Parker had given me was marked in red, a shopping center about 2 miles southeast that had been designated as a military checkpoint. If we had to move everyone, this would be our best option, I said, pointing to the extraction point. But getting there means moving through potentially infected areas at night. Marcus studied the map. There's a service tunnel that runs under part of this route, he said, tracing a line with his finger. Maintenance access for city utilities. It would keep us out of sight for at least half the journey. Do you know how to access it? I asked. He nodded. There's an entrance near the school, in the park across the street. I used to work for the city water department before joining the police. It was a slim chance, but better than nothing. We began preparing emergency evacuation packs, essential supplies, water, what little medical equipment could be transported. We assigned buddies to elderly and children, ensuring no one would be left behind if we had to move quickly. As midnight approached, the situation outside worsened. The infected had nearly doubled in number, now pressing against the perimeter fence with increasing force. In several places, the fence was beginning to bend inward under their combined weight. It's not going to hold, Marcus said grimly as we watched from the roof. Not against that many. He was right. The fence had been designed to keep students in and trespassers out, not to withstand the sustained pressure of dozens of infected. And beyond the fence, I could see more shadowy figures moving toward the school, drawn by some primal instinct to the presence of the uninfected. I made the call. We evacuate now, before the perimeter fails completely. We use the darkness to our advantage, move quietly to the service tunnel entrance. Daniel looked uncertain. Moving nearly 150 people quietly, with children, the elderly, If we wait until they breach the fence, we'll be fighting our way out, I countered. Right now, we still control when and how we leave. It was a terrible choice, gambling the lives of everyone on a nighttime evacuation through infected territory versus waiting for a breach that seemed increasingly inevitable. But in the hours I'd spent with these survivors, I'd come to feel responsible for them. I couldn't watch them be overwhelmed when there was still a chance. Daniel finally nodded. I'll start organizing people. How long do we have? I looked at the fence, calculating its remaining strength against the growing pressure. 1 hour? No more. As Daniel gathered the community leaders to initiate the evacuation plan, I used my radio to make one last attempt at official help. No response came. We were on our own. In that moment, I remembered something from my prison work, a principle of containment that had guided my career. The most secure prison isn't the one with the highest walls or the most guards. It's the one where the inmates believe escape is impossible. Perception creates reality. What we needed now was to reverse that principle. These infected were contained by their own limited perceptions. If we could move without triggering their hunting instincts, we might just make it through. With that thought, I began the final preparations for our desperate nighttime exodus. Little did I know that the journey to the extraction point would force me to confront horrors far beyond what I'd witnessed at Gateway Hospital, and make decisions that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The evacuation plan came together with remarkable speed. These people had already been living in crisis mode for over 24 hours, and they responded to clear direction with disciplined efficiency. Parents soothed frightened children. The elderly were paired with stronger adults. Essential supplies were distributed in backpacks and bags. Sarah, the nurse, had prepared medical kits for each group. Mostly first aid supplies, she told me, but also sedatives for anyone who might need to be kept quiet. The grim implication was clear. If someone was injured or panicking, silence might be more important than comfort. Marcus and I finalized the route. He knew the service tunnel entrance was in a maintenance shed near the park's public restrooms. The tunnel itself ran nearly a mile under the residential district before emerging near a commercial area. From there, we'd have to move above ground for the remaining distance to the extraction point. The tunnel hasn't been used much since they updated the water system, Marcus explained. It should be clear, but I can't guarantee it. Better than the streets, I replied, looking at the growing mass of infected outside. We divided the survivors into 5 groups of roughly 30 people each. Each group had a leader, a rear guard, and designated helpers for children and the elderly. We would move in sequence, maintaining communication via handheld radios set to low volume. Daniel addressed everyone in the gymnasium before we departed. Stay with your group, move quietly and slowly, follow your leader's instructions without question. Remember, we're all getting out together. The calm in his voice belied the desperation of our situation. These people had trusted him when they first sought shelter in the school. Now they were trusting him, trusting us, with their lives again. I would lead the first group, with Marcus guiding us to the tunnel entrance. The plan was for each subsequent group to follow at 5-minute intervals. This would prevent a bottleneck at the tunnel entrance while ensuring we didn't become too spread out. The most dangerous part would be the initial exit from the school and crossing to the park. We'd have to pass through the perimeter, where infected were already gathering in force. I gathered my group near a side exit that faced the park. This door had the advantage of being partially concealed by landscaping and the shortest distance to cross to reach the park. Remember, I told them quietly, move slowly. No running unless absolutely necessary. The infected are drawn to rapid movement and loud sounds. Stay close together, but don't crowd. If someone falls behind, their buddy stays with them while alerting the rear guard. Sarah was in my group. She added, if you're injured, signal silently. Don't call out. We'll come to you. I peered through the door's window. The infected were concentrated at the main entrance and the most visible parts of the fence. Our exit point was relatively clear, with only 3 or 4 infected visible within the immediate vicinity. I distributed the few weapons we had, mainly improvised clubs and knives. These are last resort only, I emphasized. Engaging the infected makes noise, which attracts more. Use only if directly threatened and no other option exists. With final preparations complete, I radioed Daniel. Group 1 ready to move. Maintain 5-minute intervals between groups. Understood, he replied. Godspeed, Thaddeus. I turned to my group. When we open this door, we move immediately but calmly, stay in formation, follow me and Marcus. I nodded to two men who would help me with the door. On my signal, I counted down with my fingers. 3, 2, 1. We opened the door as quietly as possible, but even the soft click of the latch seemed painfully loud in the night air. Almost immediately, the nearest infected turned toward the sound, but they didn't immediately charge. Instead, they seemed to hesitate, as if confused by our slow, deliberate movement. I led the group out, maintaining a measured pace that felt agonizingly slow, given the danger. We moved across the school grounds toward the fence gate that would lead to the street. Marcus had unlocked it earlier, ensuring we wouldn't need to make noise opening it. The infected began to move toward us, but their approach was sluggish, almost uncertain. Dr. Chen's information about their compromised visual acuity seemed accurate. They sensed our presence, but struggled to target us precisely because of our slow movement. We made it through the gate and onto the street. The park entrance was about 100 yards away. In daylight, we could have crossed in less than a minute. At our current pace, it would take 5 times that long. Every step felt like an eternity, especially as more infected began to notice our movement. A child in our group started to whimper, frightened by the approaching infected. Her mother quickly soothed her, but the sound had drawn attention. 2 infected changed direction, moving more purposefully toward the noise. I signaled to the group to maintain pace while adjusting our formation, slightly to put more adults between the infected and the child. We continued our methodical progress toward the park entrance. The street was littered with abandoned vehicles and debris, forcing us to navigate carefully. Each obstacle slowed us further, but also provided momentary cover from the infected's limited perception. We were halfway to the park when disaster nearly struck. An elderly man stumbled over debris, falling to one knee with a surprised gasp. The sound was relatively quiet, but in the tense silence, it might as well have been a shout. Several infected turned sharply toward the noise. One let out that distinctive guttural sound I'd first heard at the hospital, a hunting call that seemed to alert others. The man's assigned buddy helped him up quickly, but the infected were already moving toward them with increasing speed. I signaled for the group to continue toward the park, while I moved back with 2 others to intercept the approaching infected. I held my makeshift weapon, a metal pipe with wrapped grip, ready but hesitated to use it. Fighting would create more noise, potentially compromising the entire evacuation. But letting the infected reach the group would be worse. Just as the first infected closed in, Marcus appeared at my side with a fire extinguisher from the school. He discharged it directly at the approaching infected, creating a cloud of white powder that seemed to disorient them. Their movements became confused, their targeting disrupted by the obscured vision. "Keep moving," Marcus whispered urgently. "The effect won't last long." We rejoined the group, continuing toward the park entrance. The infected Marcus had disoriented were already recovering, but the delay had bought us precious time. We reached the park entrance and moved quickly toward the maintenance shed Marcus had identified. It was small, barely noticeable among the trees and playground equipment. Marcus led us directly to it, producing a utility key from his pocket. "City maintenance keys still work," he explained as he unlocked the shed. "Some advantages to being a former municipal employee." Inside, he revealed a hatch in the floor that led to the service tunnel. One by one, our group descended the metal ladder into the darkness below. I remained at the entrance with Marcus, watching for the second group and keeping an eye on the infected that had followed us into the park. 10 minutes passed with no sign of the second group. According to our plan, they should have already been approaching the park. I used the radio, keeping my voice at the lowest audible level. "Daniel, this is Thaddeus. Group 1 has reached the tunnel entrance. No sign of Group 2. Status?" Static, then his voice, tense but controlled. "Perimeter breach at the main entrance. Infected broke through in force. Groups 2 and 3 are rerouting to the east exit. Groups 4 and 5 are holding position." The plan was already unraveling. "Can you make it to the park from the east side?" "Uncertain. Heavy infected presence on that route. We may need to find an alternate path to the extraction point." This was the scenario I'd feared. Our unified evacuation, splitting into separate journeys through infected territory. "Use the map I showed you. If you can't reach the tunnel, head for the secondary route along the creek bed. We'll meet at the extraction point." "Understood. Be safe, Thaddeus." I turned to Marcus. "We need to get moving. The others may not make it to this entrance." He nodded grimly. "What about them?" He gestured toward the infected that had followed us. now wandering somewhat aimlessly in the park, occasionally moving closer to the shed. We close the hatch behind us. Hope they don't figure it out. We descended into the tunnel, securing the hatch from below. The service tunnel was surprisingly large, about 8 feet in diameter, with a flat walkway along one side. Emergency lights provided minimal illumination, operating on backup power systems designed to function during outages. Our group had waited for us, huddled together in the dim light. I could see the fear on their faces, mixed with desperate hope that this underground passage might lead to safety. The others may take different routes, I explained quietly. We continue as planned. The tunnel runs for nearly a mile. We maintain silence and steady pace. The tunnel was cool and damp, smelling of earth and stagnant water. The weak emergency lighting cast long shadows, creating an eerie atmosphere that heightened everyone's anxiety. But it was infinitely preferable to the infected-filled streets above. We moved in single file, Marcus leading the way. I took the rear position, keeping watch for any signs of pursuit. The curved walls created strange acoustics, where distant sounds sometimes seemed closer than they were. More than once I spun around at what sounded like footsteps behind us, only to find empty tunnel. About halfway through, we encountered our first real obstacle. A section of tunnel had partially collapsed, leaving only a narrow passage to squeeze through. We had to help the children and elderly navigate this bottleneck, slowing our progress considerably. As a larger man was struggling through the tight space, we heard something that froze my blood from far behind us, the distinct sound of the access hatch opening. Someone, or something, had followed us into the tunnel. "Keep moving," I whispered urgently to the group. "Don't stop for anything." I positioned myself at the collapsed section, prepared to hold off whatever might be coming, while the rest of the group continued forward. Marcus understood immediately, staying behind with me, while sending the others ahead with Sarah. We waited in tense silence, straining to hear over the sounds of our group moving away. The acoustics played tricks, making it hard to gauge distance, but the sounds of movement from behind us were unmistakable. Then, a voice called out in a harsh whisper, "Thaddeus?" "Marcus?" Not an infected. I risked a response. "Identify yourself." "It's Daniel, with survivors from Group 2. Relief washed over me. "How many?" 23. "We lost some in the breach. The others are taking alternate routes." Daniel and his group reached us. Their faces showed the trauma of what they'd experienced. The school's defenses had collapsed faster than anticipated. The infected had poured in, forcing them to fight their way out. "Groups 3 and 4 are heading for the creek route," Daniel reported. "Group 5 was still in the gymnasium when we left. They were going to barricade themselves in and wait for military extraction." I didn't share my doubts about military extraction ever arriving. Instead, I focused on our immediate goal. We need to keep moving. The extraction point is still our best chance. Our combined groups continued through the tunnel. Daniel fell in beside me at the rear guard position. "It was a bloodbath," he said quietly so the others couldn't hear. "The fence gave way all at once. Dozens of them poured in. We couldn't save everyone." I put a hand on his shoulder. "You got 23 out. Focus on that." He nodded, but the weight of those left behind was visible in his eyes. After what seemed like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, Marcus called back that we were approaching the exit. This was another critical moment. We had no way of knowing what awaited us above ground. The exit was similar to the entrance, a maintenance access point with a ladder leading up to a secured hatch. Marcus climbed first to scout while we waited anxiously below. When he returned, his expression was grim. "We're in the utility area behind a strip mall. Good news is it's partially enclosed, gives us some cover. Bad news is there are infected in the area. Not as concentrated as at the school, but they're out there." I assessed our options. "How far to the extraction point from here?" "About a mile, mostly commercial district, wider streets, more open space." Which meant more visibility, but also more room to maneuver around infected. A trade-off. "We stick to the original plan," I decided. "Move slowly, stay quiet, use cover when available. Same formation as before." We emerged from the tunnel in small groups, gathering in the shadow of a loading dock area. The night was clear, stars visible above the darkened city. In the distance, fires burned, sending columns of smoke into the sky. Occasional gunfire echoed from various directions. Other survivors fighting for their lives, or military operations continuing despite the evacuation pullback. I consulted the map Lieutenant Parker had given me. The extraction point was southeast of our position, requiring us to move through what had been a commercial district. According to the map, it was still marked as a yellow zone, but the situation was clearly fluid. What had been yellow this morning could easily be red now. Our expanded group, now over 50 people, would be harder to move inconspicuously. I decided to split us again into smaller units that would travel parallel routes but stay within sight of each other. This would reduce our visibility while maintaining our collective strength. Daniel would lead one section, Marcus another, and I would take the third. Sarah distributed the remaining medical supplies among the three groups. We synchronized our watches and prepared to move out. Before we left the relative safety of the loading dock, I gathered the leaders for final instructions. Remember what we learned at the school. The infected respond primarily to sound and rapid movement. Keep it slow and quiet. If you encounter infected in your path, don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Detour around them when possible. Daniel nodded. What if we get separated? Keep moving toward the extraction point. If one group doesn't arrive by dawn, the others continue to the military checkpoint. The unspoken understanding was clear. We couldn't afford to wait or search for missing people. The extraction window would be limited, and we had to be there when it opened. As we prepared to depart, I noticed a mother soothing her young son, who looked about 6 years old. She was telling him they were playing a special game of Quiet Explorer, where the goal was to move without making any noise. Her creativity in shielding him from the horror of their situation struck me deeply. In that moment, I realized what we were fighting for. Not just survival, but the chance for these children to have a future where Quiet Explorer would just be a game again, not a desperate strategy to avoid death. Our three groups moved out in sequence, merging from the loading dock area into the abandoned commercial streets. The scene was one of abrupt desertion, storefronts with lights still on, but no one inside, cars parked at odd angles, personal belongings scattered where they'd been dropped in panic, and the infected. They weren't as concentrated as at the school, but they were present, wandering singly or in small groups. They moved with that distinctive gait, not quite stumbling, not quite walking. Sometimes they stood completely still, as if listening. Other times they seemed to fixate on something invisible to us, staring at empty space before moving on. My group navigated between abandoned vehicles, using them as cover when infected drew too close. The slow pace was psychologically exhausting. Every instinct screamed to run, especially when the infected seemed to notice us. But running would only trigger their predatory response. We were about halfway to the extraction point when something changed in the infected's behavior. Several that had been wandering aimlessly suddenly stopped, then turned in unison toward the east. Within moments, they were moving with purpose in that direction, ignoring us completely. I signaled for my group to hold position, using the radio to contact Daniel and Marcus. "Are you seeing this?" "They're all moving east," Marcus confirmed. "Something's drawing them." Then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of automatic weapons fire, coming from the direction the infected were heading. Not sporadic shots, but sustained fire. Military operations. "Could be the extraction point," Daniel suggested. "Military establishing a perimeter. Or it could be a trap, drawing the infected away from an area they wanted to clear. Either way, it created an opportunity for us. New plan, I decided. While they're distracted, we move more quickly. Direct route to the extraction point. With the infected's attention focused elsewhere, we increased our pace, the three groups converging into a single unit again for better protection. We moved as quickly as we dared through streets that were eerily empty of immediate threats. The gunfire continued, punctuated by what sounded like explosions. Whatever was happening was major, not just a small military unit, but a coordinated operation. I found myself wondering if it related to the Phase 2 that Dr. Chen had mentioned. We were within a quarter mile of the extraction point when we encountered a military checkpoint. Not our destination, but a forward position. Soldiers in full tactical gear had established a barricade across the street, with mounted weapons and spotlights. As we approached, they spotted us immediately. "Halt! Identify yourselves!" a voice commanded through a speaker system. I stepped forward. "Civilian evacuation group from Northwest Residential Sector." We were directed to the extraction point at the shopping center. There was a pause then. "Approach slowly, single file, hands visible." We complied, relief mixing with apprehension. The military presence meant security, but also rigid protocols that might not accommodate our large civilian group. A soldier who appeared to be in charge met us at the barricade. "How many in your group?" 53, I replied, evacuated from a school shelter after perimeter breach. He looked surprised. "You moved 53 civilians through Yellow Zone at night, without military escort?" "We didn't have a choice. The perimeter failed." He studied me, then the group behind me. "Wait here." He moved to a communication setup and spoke urgently into a radio, occasionally glancing back at us. After a tense minute, he returned. "Orders are to process your group for transport to the primary green zone, priority for children and elderly." It was better than I'd dared hope. "What about the extraction point at the shopping center?" "Compromised 2 hours ago. That's what you're hearing." He gestured toward the continued sounds of battle. "Major infected swarm hit the perimeter. We're cleaning it up now." If we had reached the original extraction point, we would have walked into a war zone. The delay caused by our detour through the tunnel might have saved us from a worse fate. The soldier directed us through the checkpoint to a staging area where military medical personnel began screening everyone for bites or other injuries. Large transport vehicles waited nearby, already loaded with other evacuees from different parts of the city. As our group was processed, the soldier pulled me aside. "You, a military consultant?" "Civilian security specialist," I corrected. "I was doing work at Gateway Hospital when the outbreak hit." He nodded, studying me with new interest. "We're short on people with security expertise. The green zone perimeter needs reinforcement. Lieutenant Wilson will want to talk to you when we get back to base." I recognized the name, Major Wilson from the briefing at the convention center. Apparently, he was coordinating the green zone security now. As I watched our group being loaded onto transports, I felt a momentary sense of accomplishment. Despite overwhelming odds, we'd brought these people to safety. Daniel caught my eye and nodded in simple acknowledgement. We'd done what seemed impossible, but the feeling was short-lived. As I was about to board the last transport, my secure communication device vibrated. Dr. Chen was reaching out. I stepped away, pretending to check something in my pocket. "This is Thaddeus." Her voice was urgent, barely above a whisper. "Where are you?" "Military checkpoint near the shopping center extraction point. We're being transported to the green zone." "Don't go with them," she said immediately. "The green zone isn't what they're telling people. It's not about protection, it's about control. Phase 2 is initiating, and they're not evacuating everyone." "What are you talking about?" "The genetic marker I mentioned, the one that makes some people resistant to rapid turning. They're segregating those people. Everyone else is being relocated to what they're calling temporary shelters. But they're not planning to maintain those shelters, Thaddeus. They're writing off anyone without the marker." The implications hit me like a physical blow. I looked at the transports, already filled with survivors from our group. "How do I know who has the marker?" "You don't. That's the point. They're not telling people. They're just separating them after screening." I had to make a decision. The transport was waiting for me, the soldier waving me to hurry up. My mind raced with possibilities and consequences. In that moment, I knew my journey through this nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was about to take an even darker turn. "I need to check something," I called to the soldier by the transport. 2 minutes. He frowned but nodded. "Make it quick. We're moving out soon." I moved behind one of the military vehicles, keeping my voice low. "Dr. Chen, are you certain about this?" "I found documents, contingency plans predating the outbreak. They've been preparing for this, Thaddeus." Her voice was strained. "They knew this was coming. By where are you now?" "Still at the research facility. They've locked down the lab, claiming it's for our protection, but we're prisoners. I managed to access a secure terminal. The data I've found, this wasn't an accident. The simultaneous outbreaks, the rapid spread pattern, this was engineered." My mind raced. If she was right, then everything about the response had been planned. The evacuation priorities, the abandoned yellow zones, the focus on essential personnel. "What about the survivors I'm with? I can't just leave them." "Your group has already been processed, yes?" "Medical screening?" "Yes, they're loading them now." "Then it's done. They've already been categorized. Resistant individuals will be directed to the primary green zone. The others," she paused, "secondary containment. They're calling it temporary, but the resource allocation tells a different story." I watched as the last of our group boarded the transports. Daniel looked back, searching for me. I raised a hand, indicating I'd be right there. The weight of the decision pressed down on me. Go with them, potentially complicit in whatever separation was coming, or break away now, when I might still be able to help. "What can I do from outside?" I asked Dr. Chen. "Get to the CDC mobile lab at the University Medical Center. I have a contact there, Dr. Novak. He's working on a treatment protocol independent of military oversight. If anyone can help those without the genetic marker, it's him." The soldier was walking toward me now, impatient. "Sir, we need to move out, now." I made my decision. "Dr. Chen, I'll try to reach Novak. Stay safe." I tucked the communication device away and turned to the soldier. "I need to speak with your commanding officer." His expression hardened. "About what?" "I have critical information about the research facility. Security protocols that aren't being followed." I was improvising, using my security credentials as leverage. He hesitated, then gestured for me to follow him to a command vehicle. Inside, a captain was reviewing tactical displays showing the ongoing operation at the compromised extraction point. "Sir, this civilian consultant says he has security information about the research facility." The captain looked up, assessing me quickly. "Name and clearance?" "Thaddeus Galloway. I was working with Lieutenant Parker's assessment team. I have information about vulnerabilities at the CDC research hub." He waved the soldier away and indicated for me to sit. "What vulnerabilities?" I was walking a dangerous line now, providing enough information to seem credible without revealing my true intentions. "The secondary power system for the containment areas has a critical flaw. If the main grid fails completely, there's a 3-second window where the locks disengage before the tertiary system activates. I discovered it while upgrading the hospital systems before evacuation." This was partly true. I had noticed this flaw in the gateway systems. The captain's interest was immediate. "Why haven't you reported this through proper channels?" "I've been with a civilian evacuation group. Just reached military contact now." I leaned forward. "Sir, this affects all CDC facilities using the same security protocol, including the University Medical Center lab." He considered this information, then reached for his radio. "This needs to be addressed immediately. The university lab contains our most promising research materials." This was my opening. "I can go directly to assess the vulnerability. I know the system intimately." He shook his head. "We'll send a security team." "With respect, sir, this requires specialized knowledge of the electronic lock override sequences. It's why I was contracted by Gateway in the first place." I was pushing hard, knowing I might only get one chance. "Every minute increases the risk of containment failure." After a moment of consideration, he nodded. "I'll authorize transport to the University Medical Center. Report directly to Security Command there." Relief washed through me, though I kept my expression professional. "Thank you, sir. Should I inform my evacuation group?" "They're already en route to primary processing. You can reconnect at the green zone after your assessment." I was being given a way out, official transport to exactly where I needed to go. The moral weight of abandoning the school survivors pressed on me, but I consoled myself with the thought that if Dr. Chen was right, I might be their only hope for something beyond secondary containment. The captain arranged for a military jeep to transport me to the University Medical Center. As we prepared to depart, I caught sight of the transports carrying our survivors pulling away. Daniel was visible in one window, his expression questioning as he saw me remaining behind. I raised a hand in what I hoped conveyed reassurance, knowing it might be the last time I saw any of them. The drive to the university was tense but revelatory. The military had established clear routes through the city, with heavily armed checkpoints at key intersections. The infected were still present, but were being systematically eliminated in areas deemed strategically important. Precision over compassion. Resources focused on specific zones, while others were effectively abandoned. We passed one such abandoned area, a residential neighborhood where infected wandered freely among burning buildings. Military personnel at the perimeter made no move to help the occasional survivor visible in windows or on rooftops. They were maintaining the line, nothing more. "Why aren't we extracting those people?" I asked the driver. He barely glanced over. "Orders are to maintain perimeter integrity, extraction only from pre-approved green and yellow zones. But there are still survivors there." Not for long, he said matter-of-factly. The callousness stunned me, though I kept my expression neutral. The University Medical Center came into view, a massive complex now fortified with military assets. Unlike the convention center, which focused on command and control, this facility was clearly research-oriented. Mobile laboratories had been set up in parking structures, helicopter pads had been established on open spaces, and the security was even more intense. My driver pulled up to a checkpoint. Security consultant for system assessment, Captain Mercer's authorization. The guard checked a tablet, then waved us through. Report to Building C, Security Command. As we drove deeper into the complex, I noted the layout, identifying potential exit routes if needed. The facility was well designed for containment, limited entry points, clear sight lines, multiple security layers. Breaking out would be as challenging as breaking in. My driver left me at Building C, where I was met by a security officer. I repeated my story about the vulnerability in the containment systems, showing my Gateway Hospital credentials and emphasizing the urgency. They escorted me to a security command center, where I was introduced to the facility's chief of security, Major Reeves. Captain Mercer sent you to assess a potential vulnerability? He asked, studying my credentials carefully. Yes, sir. The tertiary power system for the electronic lock mechanisms has a critical flaw that could compromise containment in the event of cascading power failure. He seemed skeptical, but not dismissive. Show me. This was the tricky part. I needed to get access to the research areas without raising suspicion. I requested system schematics, which he provided on a secure terminal. Using my actual knowledge of such systems, I identified several legitimate but minor vulnerabilities while gathering information about the facility layout. These can be addressed with simple programming adjustments, I explained, making technical recommendations that would sound legitimate to someone with security background. But I need to physically inspect the lock mechanisms in the primary research wing to ensure compatibility with the update protocols. Major Reeves considered this, then nodded. I'll assign an escort, full access to security systems only. Research areas remain restricted. It wasn't ideal, but it got me inside. My escort was a young lieutenant who clearly took his job seriously. As he led me through the facility, I noted the organization of different sections, administrative areas, general research, and the highly secured containment wing. What exactly are they researching here? I asked casually as we walked. Above my pay grade, the lieutenant responded. But whatever it is, it's priority one. We've got more brass visiting this facility than the Pentagon. Military brass or government? Both. Had a senator through yesterday, and some pharmaceutical executives this morning. Pharmaceutical executives during a zombie outbreak. Interesting priority. I filed that information away as we continued our inspection. I made a show of examining security panels and lock mechanisms, offering legitimate technical advice while searching for any sign of Dr. Novak or access to the CDC mobile lab Dr. Chen had mentioned. The facility was enormous, and without knowing exactly where to look, finding one specific researcher would be nearly impossible. After about an hour of this, an alert came over the facility's PA system. All security personnel report to stations. VIP arrival in 10 minutes. My escort frowned. We need to wrap this up. Secure areas will be locked down during the visit. This might be my only opportunity. I just need to check the main circuit panel for the containment wing. Should only take 5 minutes. He hesitated, then nodded. Make it quick. He led me to a utility room that housed the power distribution panels for the high security areas. As he stood watch at the door, I made a show of examining connections while secretly disconnecting a key relay that would trigger an alert in about 30 minutes. Not an immediate security breach, but a malfunction that would require attention. All set, I told him. System should be secure now. As we exited the utility area, the facility was buzzing with activity related to the VIP arrival. Security personnel were taking positions, and research staff were being directed to clear certain corridors. Who's visiting that requires this much security? I asked. My escort checked his radio. Director of FEMA, CDC Leadership and Military Command. Big strategy meeting about containment progression. The phrase containment progression sent a chill through me. It sounded like exactly the kind of meeting where decisions about who lived and who died would be made. We were passing a staff break room when I glimpsed a familiar face, Dr. Novak, the CDC doctor I'd met at the convention center. He was alone, reviewing documents while drinking coffee. "I need to use the restroom," I told my escort abruptly. He pointed down the hall. "Right there. Make it quick." I entered the restroom, waited a few moments, then carefully peered out. My escort was checking his radio again, back partially turned. I slipped out and moved quickly to the break room where Dr. Novak sat. He looked up in surprise as I entered. "Galloway, what are you doing here?" I kept my voice low. "Doctor, Chen sent me." From the main research facility, his expression changed instantly, caution replacing surprise. "I'm not sure what you're talking about. The resistant genetic marker, the separation protocols, the pre-outbreak contingency plans." I spoke rapidly, watching his face for reaction. "She said you're working on an independent treatment protocol." He glanced at the door, then gestured for me to sit. "Not here. Too many ears." He scribbled something on a notepad and slid it to me. A location and time. Basement level 3, lab 12, midnight. I nodded slightly and stood as my escort appeared in the doorway, looking irritated. "Sir, we need to clear this area now." Dr. Novak spoke smoothly. "Just offering some coffee to your security consultant. Must be thirsty work checking all those systems." The escort wasn't amused. "We need to complete your assessment and get you out before the lockdown." I followed him, glancing back once to see Dr. Novak watching me thoughtfully before returning to his documents. For the next hour, I continued the security assessment, focusing on areas that would give me a better understanding of the facility layout. I noted access points, security patterns, and potential routes to basement level 3, all while providing legitimate technical feedback that would maintain my cover. As we were completing the assessment in a secondary security control room, my sabotage in the utility room triggered the alert I'd planned. "System fault in containment section B power distribution," announced the monitoring system. "Backup systems engaged. Maintenance required." The security team sprang into action, my escort included. "Wait here," he instructed me. "This needs to be addressed immediately." As they focused on the alert, I took advantage of the distraction to access the security terminal. Using skills developed over years of prison security work, I quickly located camera feeds for basement level 3 and memorized the guard rotation patterns. I also noted that Lab 12 appeared to require special access credentials. It was more isolated than the surrounding labs. My escort returned looking harried. "False alarm, but we need to run diagnostics. Your assessment report has been logged. Security will escort you back to the transport area." I was being dismissed, but I had what I needed: confirmation of Dr. Novak's location and a tentative plan to reach him at midnight. Now, I just needed to remain within the facility until then. As we headed toward the exit, the VIP convoy arrived. Security personnel lined the corridors as a group of officials moved through the facility. Among them, I recognized several high-ranking military officers, CDC officials in distinctive jackets, and a man I was pretty sure was the FEMA director from news briefings. But what caught my attention was the pharmaceutical executive walking alongside them, a tall, severe-looking woman whose company logo I recognized from medical supply contracts with the prison system. Why was a private corporation involved at this level of emergency response? My escort hurried me past, but I caught fragments of conversation. Phase 2. Implementation by dawn. Segregation protocols functioning as designed. Resistant populations responding well to initial trials. We reached the transport area, where I was to be returned to the checkpoint I'd come from. But I couldn't leave, not when I was so close to potentially crucial information from Dr. Novak. I needed a new plan, and fast. Looking around, I noticed medical staff coming and going from a side entrance, showing credentials to a guard who seemed to be checking them against a roster. If I could obtain credentials, I might be able to remain inside. As my escort handed me off to the transport team, I made a split-second decision. I left my toolkit in Building C. Security systems won't be fully functional without completing the programming updates. The transport officer looked annoyed. "Can't someone bring it to you?" "It contains specialized equipment. I need to retrieve it personally and finish the security update before leaving." After a brief radio exchange, I was allowed to return to Building C with a different escort. This bought me time, but I still needed a way to stay until midnight. As we walked, I noticed staff changing shifts, day personnel leaving, night staff arriving. The facility was moving into evening operations. In the security control room, I made a show of looking for my non-existent toolkit while observing staff movements. The shift change created brief confusion I might be able to exploit. I noticed medical staff credentials being verified at internal checkpoints, electronic badges with specific color coding. "I think someone moved my kit to the main security office," I told my escort. "Can we check there?" The main security office was busier, with personnel coming and going during the shift change. While my escort inquired about the toolkit, I observed the credential system. Staff were scanning badges at a terminal that verified their access levels. A plan formed, risky but possible. I needed to create confusion, acquire credentials, and disappear into the facility until my midnight meeting with Dr. Novak. The alert I'd set earlier had been diagnosed as a minor malfunction, but the system was still running diagnostics. From the security terminal, I could see that certain sections were operating on backup protocols. If I created another, more significant disruption to the power distribution system, the resulting confusion might provide the opportunity I needed. When my escort stepped away briefly to speak with a supervisor, I accessed the nearest terminal under the guise of checking security protocols. With a few quick commands masked as system diagnostics, I programmed a cascading power fluctuation to begin in 20 minutes, enough time for me to be in position. "Sir, your toolkit isn't logged anywhere in the system," my escort informed me upon returning. "We need to complete your exit processing." I feigned confusion and concern. "Without those tools, the security update is incomplete. The containment locks will remain vulnerable." I lowered my voice. Given today's high-level meeting, I wouldn't want to be responsible for any security failures. This struck a nerve. After another consultation with his supervisor, it was decided I would remain to complete the essential security updates. I was issued a temporary contractor badge, not full access, but enough to move through certain areas with an escort. As we headed back to the utility room, where I'd staged the initial malfunction, I was mentally counting down to the power fluctuation I'd programmed. I needed to be near medical personnel when it happened to have any chance at acquiring better credentials in the confusion. We passed a group of medical staff heading to the research wing, exactly where I needed to be when the systems failed. "I need to check the distribution panel for that wing as well," I told my escort. "The vulnerability could affect all similar systems." He frowned but complied, leading me toward the research area where the medical team was heading. As we approached the security checkpoint, my internal countdown reached 0. Right on schedule, the lights flickered, then went out completely. Emergency lighting activated immediately, bathing the corridor in dim red light. Alarms sounded as security systems reset. "All personnel remain in place," announced the PA system. "Security Protocol Delta in effect. Stand by for further instructions." My escort immediately reached for his radio. Attention diverted to the facility-wide issue. The medical team ahead of us had stopped at the checkpoint, their credential verification interrupted by the power failure. In the red-tinged confusion, with security personnel focused on potential containment breaches, I made my move. I slipped away from my distracted escort, merged with the group of medical staff, and followed them as they were ushered through the checkpoint under emergency protocols. Once past the checkpoint, I separated from the group, moving purposefully as if I belonged. In emergencies, people rarely question someone who moves with confidence. I found a supply closet and ducked inside to wait out the initial response phase. I'd successfully infiltrated the research wing, but the hard part was yet to come. I still needed to reach basement level 3, find Lab 12, and meet Dr. Novak at midnight, all while avoiding the security teams that would certainly be looking for me once my absence was noticed. And beyond that lay an even greater challenge. Whatever information Dr. Novak had might force me to make choices that would determine not just my fate, but potentially the fate of everyone I'd left behind. I remained in the supply closet for nearly an hour, listening to the security response unfold outside. The power disruption had caused exactly the kind of controlled chaos I'd hoped for. Enough to create openings in security, but not enough to trigger a full facility lockdown. Through the door, I heard radio communications indicating they were searching for a missing contractor. They had my description, but didn't seem to consider me a high-priority threat, just a civilian who had wandered off during the confusion. Their primary concern was securing the research areas and ensuring no containment breaches had occurred. When the immediate activity died down, I carefully opened the door and peered out. The corridor was empty, emergency systems had restored partial lighting, and the facility had returned to a heightened but functioning state. Now, I needed to find my way to basement level 3 without being detected. From my earlier security assessment, I remembered that the research building had multiple stairwells, but most would be monitored by cameras or guards. Service access points, however, might offer less scrutinized routes. Maintenance and custodial staff typically had pathways through facilities that security often overlooked. I left the closet and moved purposefully down the corridor, looking for service access signs. Acting as though I belonged there was my best camouflage. When I heard approaching footsteps, I ducked into an unoccupied office and waited until they passed. Near the end of the corridor, I found what I was looking for, a door marked Maintenance Access. It required a key card, but unlike the sophisticated biometric systems protecting research areas, this was a simple electronic lock. Years of working with prison security systems had taught me various workarounds for such barriers. From my pocket, I pulled out my locksmith tools, small implements I always carried that security hadn't confiscated during my official entry. Using a thin metal probe, I was able to trigger the emergency mechanical release mechanism hidden within the card reader's housing. The lock disengaged with a soft click. The maintenance access opened onto a narrow utility corridor containing pipes, electrical conduits, and a metal staircase. This infrastructure spine ran through the building, providing access to mechanical systems while remaining largely invisible to the facility's regular occupants. Perfect for my needs. I descended the stairs, counting the levels. Ground floor, basement 1, basement 2, and finally, basement 3. The door here was similar to the one above, and I used the same technique to bypass it. Before opening it, I pressed my ear against the cold metal, listening for any activity on the other side. Hearing nothing, I cautiously pushed it open. Basement level 3 was noticeably different from the upper floors. The corridors were wider, the lighting more clinical. Signs indicated various research labs, each with numeric designations. I needed to find Lab 12 without being spotted by security. I moved quietly, staying close to the wall, pausing at each intersection to check for cameras or personnel. The facility seemed less staffed at this level, perhaps due to the late hour or the security incident upstairs. This worked in my favor. Following the numbering system, I made my way toward Lab 12. As I approached, I noticed something unusual. While most labs had standard security doors with electronic locks, Lab 12 had an additional security layer, an anteroom with a separate access system. This matched what I'd glimpsed on the security monitors earlier. Whatever Dr. Novak was working on clearly warranted extra protection. It was still an hour before our agreed meeting time. I found a janitorial closet near the lab and concealed myself inside to wait, leaving the door slightly ajar so I could monitor the corridor. The closet was cramped but provided a good observation point. During my wait, I observed security patrols passing at approximately 20-minute intervals. I also noted 3 researchers entering nearby labs, suggesting that work continued through the night, despite the earlier disruption. None approached Lab 12. At precisely midnight, I saw Dr. Novak appear at the far end of the corridor. He moved cautiously, checking repeatedly over his shoulder. When he reached Lab 12, he entered a code on the keypad and performed what appeared to be a biometric scan. The door unlocked and he slipped inside, leaving it slightly open behind him. I waited until the corridor was clear, then moved quickly to the lab entrance. Slipping through the partially open door, I found myself in the anteroom I'd observed earlier. Dr. Novak was waiting, his expression tense. "You made it," he said quietly. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't." "Had some complications with security," I replied. "They're looking for me." He gestured toward an inner door. "We don't have much time. Follow me." The main laboratory beyond was state-of-the-art, filled with equipment I couldn't begin to identify. Biological containment units lined one wall, computer stations displayed complex molecular diagrams, and at the center, a secure glass enclosure contained what appeared to be medical beds, though currently empty. "This is an independent research initiative," Dr. Novak explained, moving to a computer terminal. "Officially, we're developing supportive care protocols for infected individuals. Unofficially, we're working on something much more significant." "A cure?" I asked hopefully. He shook his head. Not exactly, at least not yet, but potentially a treatment that could slow or halt the progression of the infection, even in those without the natural resistance marker. Dr. Chen mentioned this genetic marker. She said the military is separating people based on who has it. She's correct. Dr. Novak pulled up files on his screen. Approximately 10% of the population carries a genetic variation that significantly slows the infection progression. When infected, these individuals remain lucid longer and retain cognitive function even after physical symptoms manifest. The military is identifying these individuals through blood screening and prioritizing them for the green zones. And everyone else? His expression darkened. Official policy is that resources are allocated based on survival probability. In practice, this means those without the marker are being placed in what they're calling secondary containment areas. Minimal resources, minimal security. The implications were horrifying. They're writing off 90% of the population. It's worse than that. He lowered his voice further. The timeline of this outbreak never made sense to me. Simultaneous emergence in multiple cities. Rapid mutation rates that seemed almost pre-adapted to human hosts. So, I started digging into research archives. He pulled up a classified document on his screen. Project Osiris, a theoretical pandemic response scenario developed jointly by military and pharmaceutical interests. It described in detail how a pathogen with these exact characteristics would spread and how response should be structured to preserve essential genetic diversity and critical infrastructure. The name struck me immediately. Osiris. That's the password Doctor Chen gave me for the encrypted drive. Doctor. Chen was one of the few who recognized what was happening. The Osiris protocol isn't just a response plan, it's a blueprint, one that was conceived long before this outbreak began. I struggled to process what he was suggesting. You're saying this was deliberate, that someone released this pathogen intentionally? I'm saying the evidence points to advanced knowledge, at minimum. Whether the release was intentional or an accident, certain power structures were prepared to exploit the situation. He gestured to the data on his screen. The genetic screening, the containment priorities, the resource allocation, it all follows the Osiris protocol exactly. But why? What's the end game? Control, he said simply. Imagine a world where only those with certain genetic characteristics survive, where resources are concentrated among a selected population, where those in power determine who lives and who dies based on genetic potential. It was monstrous, almost beyond comprehension. Yet the evidence was before me, the selective evacuations, the abandoned zones, the focus on certain populations over others. What about your research here? I asked. You said you're working on a treatment? Dr. Novak moved to the biological containment units. We've been analyzing blood samples from individuals with the resistance marker, identifying the specific mechanisms that slow the infection. Based on this, we've developed an experimental compound that might mimic those effects in non-resistant individuals. Might? Early tests are promising, but not conclusive. The compound needs further refinement and clinical trials, which we're not authorized to conduct. Official policy is to focus all research on the resistant population, not on treatment for the general public. So you're conducting unauthorized research? He nodded. A small group of us believe everyone deserves a chance, not just those with the right genes. We've been working in shifts using resources diverted from official projects. What do you need to make it viable? Time and additional samples. He sighed. Both in short supply. The Phase 2 implementation Dr. Chen mentioned is scheduled for dawn, complete separation of resistant and non-resistant populations. After that, access to diverse genetic samples will be severely restricted. I thought of the survivors from the school, now being processed for containment. How many of them had the resistance marker? How many were being consigned to what amounted to death zones? I need to get your treatment out, I said decisively. Even in experimental form, people should have that chance. Dr. Novak looked doubtful. It's not ready. The side effects could be severe, and the military would never allow it to leave this facility. I'm not planning to ask permission. I gestured around the lab. Can you prepare samples? Something portable that could be administered in field conditions? He considered this, then nodded slowly. I can prepare several doses of the current formulation, basic injection delivery, but without proper monitoring, I can't guarantee results. Better than no chance at all, I insisted. As Dr. Novak began gathering materials, I pressed him for more information. The VIP meeting today, what was it about? Finalizing Phase 2 implementation. The pharmaceutical executive you probably saw, Elaine Vickers, her company secured exclusive rights to all treatment protocols developed from the resistant population research. They're already setting up production facilities in the green zones. They're profiting from this, I realized, creating a market for treatments where none existed before. Precisely, a captive market with no alternatives, and government contracts to supply essential personnel with protection. His disgust was evident. Meanwhile, millions are sacrificed because they don't have the right genetic profile. Dr. Novak finished preparing a case containing several vials of pale yellow liquid and sterile injection supplies. Each dose should slow infection progression by approximately 12 hours if administered early. It won't prevent turning, but it buys time. Time for what? For a true cure to be developed. He handed me the case. If enough people survive with their faculties intact, someone will eventually find a solution. The official research is focused on protecting the resistant, not curing the infected. That's the wrong approach. I secured the case inside my jacket. How do I get this out? The facility is locked down. There's a research sample transport scheduled for 2 a.m, refrigerated truck heading to a secondary facility. I can add your credentials to the manifest as a technical escort. He moved to a computer terminal. It won't stand up to close scrutiny, but it might get you past the checkpoint. As he worked, an alarm suddenly blared throughout the facility. Security alert. Unauthorized access detected in Research Wing B. All personnel initiate containment procedures. Dr. Novak froze. They've discovered the breach. Is that us? I asked, already moving toward the door. Unlikely. We're in Research Wing C. He checked a security monitor. Something's happening in the containment area. Looks like... He stopped abruptly. Oh God. The monitor showed chaos in another section of the basement level. Security personnel were rushing toward what appeared to be a breach in a secure containment room. And emerging from that room were infected, not wandering aimlessly, but moving with horrible purpose. They were keeping live subjects for testing, Dr. Novak explained, horror in his voice. If they've broken containment, the facility's PA system confirmed our fears. Biohazard containment breach in Research Wing B. All personnel evacuate using Protocol Epsilon. This is not a drill. Dr. Novak grabbed a tablet and began downloading files. This is actually our opportunity. During an evacuation, security focuses on containing the threat and moving essential personnel. The loading dock will be used for evacuation vehicles. Including the sample transport? Exactly. With the confusion, you can blend with evacuation traffic. He finished the download and handed me the tablet. Take this too. Complete research data on the treatment protocol. Find someone who can continue the work. The sounds of chaos were growing closer. Shouts, occasional gunfire, and that distinctive inhuman noise I'd come to recognize from the infected. What about you? I asked. I'll evacuate with the research staff. We'll regroup at the backup facility. He moved to a cabinet and produced an access card. This will get you to the loading dock. Tell them you're with Sample Transport T7. They'll be too busy to check closely. The alarms continued as we prepared to leave the lab. Dr. Novak checked the security monitors one more time, charting us a path away from the containment breach. The infected hadn't reached our section yet, but they were spreading rapidly throughout Research Wing B. Ready? He asked. I nodded, securing the precious treatment vials and research data. Thank you for this. I'll make sure it reaches people who need it. He looked at me soberly. You understand the risk you're taking? If the military discovers you have this, they'll classify you as a threat to the Osiris Protocol. They'll eliminate that threat without hesitation. I understand, and I did. I was transitioning from survivor to something more dangerous, someone with knowledge that contradicted the official narrative, someone with the potential to disrupt carefully laid plans for who would survive this apocalypse and who wouldn't. We left the lab together, moving quickly through corridors now filled with evacuating personnel. The emergency had created exactly the kind of controlled chaos I needed. Security was focused on the containment breach, not on checking identification of evacuees. Dr. Novak led me through a series of service corridors, avoiding the main evacuation routes where security would be heaviest. The loading dock is 2 levels up. Take the service elevator at the end of this hall. As we rounded a corner, we encountered a security team, escorting research staff to evacuation points. Their leader recognized Dr. Novak immediately. "Doctor, you need to evacuate with essential personnel. Transport is waiting." Dr. Novak nodded. "I was securing critical samples. This is my technical assistant helping with transport." The guard barely glanced at me, focused on the more immediate threat of infected potentially breaking through from Research Wing B. "Essential personnel this way. Technical staff report to the loading dock for secondary evacuation." Dr. Novak gave me a significant look as he was ushered away with the high-priority evacuees. Our paths were diverging, he to the protected green zone, me to whatever lay beyond with my dangerous cargo. I continued toward the service elevator, moving with purpose among the organized evacuation. No one questioned me, a testament to how security breaks down during crisis. People see what they expect to see, and right now, they expected to see staff following evacuation protocols. The service elevator was being used for equipment transport, largely unmonitored by security who were focused on personnel elevators. I boarded with a group of technicians moving laboratory equipment, none of whom gave me a second glance. As the elevator rose toward the loading dock level, I mentally prepared for the next phase. Getting out of the facility was just the beginning. I needed to reconnect with Dr. Chen if possible, verify what had happened to the school survivors, and find a way to distribute the experimental treatment to those who needed it most. The elevator opened onto a scene of controlled industry. The loading dock was busy with vehicles being loaded with equipment and supplies. Military personnel supervised, but they were clearly prioritizing movement speed over thorough security checks. I spotted the refrigerated transport truck Dr. Novak had mentioned, marked with biohazard symbols and sample transport T7 on its manifest. 2 technicians were loading carefully packaged containers under the supervision of a distracted guard. I approached confidently, showing the access card Dr. Novak had given me. "Final samples for transport," I stated, indicating the case concealed inside my jacket. The technician barely looked up. "Manifest? Added last minute by Dr. Novak. Priority research materials." He checked his tablet, frowning slightly. "Not seeing it, but systems are lagging with the evacuation protocols." He shrugged. "Load it yourself. Secure compartment B. We're departing in 5 minutes." As I moved toward the truck, a commotion at the far end of the loading dock caught everyone's attention. Security personnel were rushing toward an apparent breach point, weapons drawn. The containment failure was spreading faster than they'd anticipated. The distraction was perfect. I quickly loaded the case into the designated compartment. Then, instead of boarding the truck, I slipped behind a stack of supply crates. The transport would leave without me, but the treatment samples were now in the system, headed for a secondary facility where they might eventually help people. The real prize was the research data on the tablet, complete protocols that could potentially be reproduced with the right equipment and expertise, that I kept with me. In the confusion of the expanding evacuation, I managed to blend with a group of non-essential personnel being directed to military transports. These vehicles were heading to the secondary containment areas, exactly where I needed to go if I wanted to find the survivors from the school. As I boarded the transport with other staff deemed non-essential, I realized my situation had shifted dramatically in just a few hours. I'd gone from helpful security consultant to fugitive with restricted information, from evacuee to infiltrator. The transport vehicle filled with anxious staff, many clearly confused about why they weren't being evacuated to the primary green zone with research leadership. I listened to their conversations, gathering valuable intelligence about facility operations and evacuation protocols. "They told us we'd all be going to the same location," one lab technician complained. "Now suddenly they're splitting us up based on some priority assessment." "It's genetic testing," another responded quietly. "My friend in medical processing told me. They're screening for some marker that determines resistance to the infection." "So what? They're just writing the rest of us off?" The conversation confirmed everything Dr. Novak had told me. The separation was already well underway, with most people unaware of the true criteria being used to determine their fate. As our transport departed the university facility, I caught a glimpse of the chaos we were leaving behind. Military personnel establishing a perimeter, infected breaking through in multiple locations, research staff being evacuated in priority order. The city beyond looked worse than when I'd arrived. More fires, more evidence of societal collapse. The infected seemed to be everywhere now, roaming in groups rather than individually, and the military response was increasingly focused on protecting specific assets rather than saving the general population. We traveled for about 20 minutes before reaching what was clearly a secondary containment area, a large high school complex surrounded by hastily erected security fencing. Unlike the university or convention center, the defenses here were minimal: a token military presence, basic medical screening, limited supplies. As we were processed into the facility, I scanned the crowds for any sign of Daniel or the other school survivors. If Dr. Chen was correct, those without the resistance marker would have been sent to a facility like this one. The screening was perfunctory: basic identification, cursory medical check, assignment to shelter areas within the school buildings. No one seemed particularly interested in my security credentials or why I was arriving from the research facility. They were simply processing bodies, moving people through a system that had already determined their value. I was assigned to a classroom being used as temporary housing for about 30 people. Cots had been set up, minimal supplies distributed. The atmosphere was one of confused anxiety. These people knew something was wrong with how they were being treated, but most didn't understand the full implications. As I settled onto an assigned cot, I carefully checked that the tablet was secure and powered down to preserve battery. The information it contained was potentially explosive, evidence of foreknowledge of the outbreak, of selective survival protocols based on genetics, of treatments being withheld from the general population. A voice came over the facility's loudspeaker system. "Attention all arrivals. This is a temporary processing center. Food and medical services are available in the main gymnasium. Please remain in your assigned areas until processed further." The phrasing sent a chill through me. Processed further could mean many things, none of them good based on what I now knew about the Osiris protocol. As night deepened toward early morning, I made a decision. I couldn't wait to be processed further. I needed to find the school survivors if they were here, share what I'd learned, and find a way to distribute the treatment information to those who could use it. The military presence was minimal within the containment area itself. Most security was focused on the perimeter. This created an opportunity to move between sections relatively unobserved. When the guard patrol passed our classroom, I slipped out into the darkened hallway. The school was large, with multiple buildings connected by covered walkways. According to orientation information, new arrivals were being processed through the gymnasium before assignment to housing areas. If Daniel and the others had been brought here, that's where they would have entered the system. I moved carefully through the corridors, avoiding the occasional patrol, making my way toward the main gymnasium. What I found there would reshape my understanding of the nightmare we were living through and force me to make decisions that would determine not just my fate, but potentially the fate of countless others caught in this engineered apocalypse. I made my way toward the gymnasium, staying close to the shadows. The school had been hastily converted into a processing center, with military and FEMA signs taped over school announcements and motivational posters. The contrast was jarring: college recruitment flyers hanging next to quarantine protocols, homecoming banners alongside infection screening directions. When I reached the gymnasium, I found it transformed into a massive processing area. Long tables staffed by medical personnel stretched across the basketball court. New arrivals were being channeled through in a systematic flow: identification, medical screening, blood testing, assignment. Even at this late hour, the process continued, though at a reduced pace. From my concealed position near an equipment storage area, I observed the procedure. Each person had blood drawn, which was immediately processed through portable testing equipment. Based on results displayed on connected tablets, individuals were marked with colored wristbands, blue or red. Those with blue bands were directed to a separate processing area on the far side of the gym. Those with red bands, the vast majority, were sent to the general housing areas I'd seen. It didn't take a genius to figure out the system. Blue bands likely indicated the resistance marker Dr. Novak had described. Those people were being identified for priority evacuation to the primary green zones. Red bands marked the expendable, those without natural resistance, destined for these under-resourced containment areas. I scanned the gymnasium for any sign of Daniel or others from the school group. The processing area was relatively empty at this hour, with only a few new arrivals being screened. If our survivors had been processed earlier, they'd be in housing areas by now. As I considered how to locate them, I noticed a medical staff member examining a computer terminal on the far side of the gym. She seemed frustrated, repeatedly trying to access data. This might be my opportunity to gather information. I straightened my clothes, assumed a purposeful expression, and walked confidently from my hiding place toward the medical station. The key was to act as if I belonged. In emergencies, authority often comes from demeanor rather than actual credentials. "System problems?" I asked casually as I approached, adopting the tone of a fellow staff member. The woman, young, probably a medical student or resident before the outbreak, looked up with a harried expression. "The network keeps dropping. I can't access the assignment database to process these new arrivals." I nodded sympathetically. "It's been swamped with the evacuation. Mind if I take a look? I was helping with system integration earlier." She eagerly moved aside, grateful for assistance. I sat at the terminal and made a show of examining the connection settings. While doing so, I navigated to the assignment database that contained records of all processed individuals. "Just needs to reconnect to the main server," I explained, typing quickly. "What information are you trying to access?" "Assignment locations for the latest groups. I have 20 people waiting for housing assignments." I nodded, continuing to work while surreptitiously searching the database. I entered approximate timeframes for when the school survivors would have been processed and scanned the results. There they were, Daniel Cooper and others from the school, processed approximately 8 hours ago. Most had been assigned red wristbands and sent to Building C. A few, 7 out of the original 53, had received blue bands and been transferred to a different facility entirely. "Should be working now," I told the medical staff member, returning the terminal to the assignment screen she needed. Server connection reestablished. She thanked me profusely, never questioning my presence or authority. I made a casual exit, now armed with the knowledge that most of our survivors were in Building C, likely unaware of the true nature of their situation. Building C was on the opposite side of the campus from where I'd been assigned. I moved carefully through the darkened corridors, avoiding the occasional patrol. The security was surprisingly light within the containment area, another indication that these people weren't considered high priority. When I reached Building C, I found it crowded with evacuees. Classrooms designed for 30 students now housed twice that many people on cots and makeshift bedding. The conditions were notably worse than in my assigned area. Fewer supplies, limited medical presence, a sense of having been forgotten. I moved through the building, checking each room until I found what I was looking for. In a former science classroom, Daniel sat on a cot, speaking quietly with a small group that included Sarah, the nurse from the school, and Marcus, the former police officer who had guided us through the service tunnel. I approached cautiously, unsure of my welcome, after seemingly abandoning them at the military checkpoint. Daniel saw me first, his expression transitioning from shock to relief to wariness. "Thaddeus?" He stood, moving toward me. "Where did you go?" "We thought you were right behind us." "It's complicated," I replied quietly. "Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" Daniel nodded, leading me and the small group to a storage room off the main classroom. Once inside, I briefly explained what had happened, my conversation with Dr. Chen, the decision to investigate the research facility, and most importantly, what I had learned about the Osiris Protocol. "They're separating people based on genetics?" Sarah asked, her medical background helping her quickly grasp the implications. "That's why they took blood samples from everyone?" "A specific genetic marker that provides partial resistance to the infection," I confirmed. "About 10% of the population has it. Those people get blue wristbands and evacuation to the primary green zones. Everyone else gets dumped here," Marcus finished grimly. "Minimal resources, minimal security." "It's worse than that," I continued. "From what Dr. Novak told me, there are no plans to maintain these secondary containment areas long term. They're temporary holding facilities while they extract everyone with the resistance marker." The implication hung in the air. Once the sorting was complete, these facilities would likely be abandoned entirely. left to fend for themselves against the increasing infected population outside. So we're expendable, Daniel said flatly. They're just going to leave us here to die. Not if I can help it, I said, taking out the tablet doctor Novak had given me. This contains research data on an experimental treatment that might help those without natural resistance. It's not a cure, but it could slow infection progression significantly if administered early. Sarah took the tablet, her medical training allowing her to understand the information better than the rest of us. This is advanced research, treatment protocols, dosing information, even production methods for the compound. She looked up at me. Where did you get this? From scientists working against the official protocol. People who believe everyone deserves a chance, not just those with the right genes. Can we produce this here? Daniel asked. Sarah shook her head. Not without laboratory facilities and pharmacological supplies. But with this information, someone with the right background could potentially reproduce it elsewhere. The treatment itself is already being transported to a secondary research facility, I explained. I managed to get samples into the official transport system. But the knowledge of it, the formula, that's what I brought here. Marcus, ever practical, focused on our immediate situation. Information won't help us if we're trapped in this containment zone. We need to find a way out before they complete whatever further processing they're planning. He was right. The valuable research wouldn't matter if we couldn't get it, and ourselves, to safety. How many of our group are here? I asked. 42 in this building, Daniel replied. The others were taken elsewhere after processing, different colored wristbands. Blue bands, I confirmed. They have the resistance marker. Sarah looked at her own red wristband with new understanding. So, the rest of us are just written off? Based on a genetic lottery? That's the Osiris Protocol, I said. Predetermined winners and losers in this apocalypse. But we can change that equation if we get this information out. We began formulating a plan. The containment area had weaknesses. Limited personnel, focus on perimeter security rather than internal movement. Predictable patrol patterns. With my security background and Marcus's police experience, we identified potential exit points. The most promising was a service gate near the athletic fields used for supply deliveries. It was guarded, but minimally, 2 personnel rotating on 4-hour shifts. With proper timing and distraction, we might be able to get a small group through. But that raised the difficult question. Who goes and who stays? We couldn't move 42 people without detection. A smaller group would have better chances of escaping with the research data. I should go, Sarah said immediately. With my medical background, I can help interpret the research, maybe even assist in producing the treatment if we find the right facilities. Marcus nodded. I'll go too. You'll need security expertise. Daniel looked torn. These people trusted me to lead them to safety. I can't just leave them. I understood his dilemma. Sometimes leadership means making hard choices. These people need someone they trust here, especially if... I didn't finish the thought, but we all understood. If the containment area was abandoned, they would need organization and leadership to have any chance of survival. After discussion, we settled on a group of 4 to attempt escape. Myself, Sarah, Marcus, and a chemistry teacher named James who had been part of our school evacuation. His knowledge could prove valuable in understanding the treatment formula. What about the others? Daniel asked. Even if you get out with the research, what happens to everyone here? It was the question that had been haunting me since learning about the Osiris Protocol. The brutal calculus of survival seemed to demand accepting some losses to save others. But I refused to accept that framework entirely. Once we're out, we find ways to come back for more people, I insisted. We establish contact with other survivor groups, share the treatment information, build a network. The military has written these people off, but we haven't. Daniel seemed somewhat reassured. When do we move? Before dawn, Marcus suggested. Guard rotation at 4. Security will be at its lowest point. We create a distraction on the opposite side of the campus, then move through the service gate while attention is diverted. As we finalized details, I shared one more critical piece of information. There's something else you all should know. From what I gathered at the research facility, this outbreak wasn't a natural occurrence. The pattern of simultaneous outbreaks in multiple cities, the specific characteristics of the pathogen, it all points to engineering, and worse, Evidence suggests certain power structures knew it was coming. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Sarah covered her mouth in shock. Marcus's expression hardened into cold fury. Daniel simply stared, processing implications too terrible to immediately accept. "You're saying someone did this deliberately?" Marcus finally asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "The evidence points that way. The Osiris Protocol existed before the outbreak. Contingency plans were in place for sorting the population based on the resistance marker. Pharmaceutical companies had preparations for treatments specifically designed for this pathogen." "Why?" Sarah whispered. "Why would anyone do this?" "Control, reshaping society. Imagine a world where only those with certain genetic characteristics survive, where resources are concentrated among a selected population, where those in power determine who lives and who dies." The room fell silent as we contemplated the magnitude of what we were facing. This wasn't just a fight for survival against a natural disaster. We were up against a coordinated effort to reshape humanity itself. "All the more reason to get that research out," Marcus finally said. "If they engineered this plague, they can damn well live with us finding a treatment that helps everyone, not just their chosen few." We dispersed to make preparations, agreeing to meet again shortly before the planned escape attempt. I returned to my assigned area briefly to avoid raising suspicion, collecting what few supplies I could gather without drawing attention. As I made my way back to Building C, I observed the containment facility with new eyes. What had initially seemed like overwhelmed emergency response now revealed itself as deliberate design. The minimal resources, the focus on processing rather than support, the segregation based on blood tests. All part of a system where human lives had been assigned value based on genetics alone. When I reached the meeting point near the athletic fields, Sarah, Marcus, and James were already waiting. Each had gathered what supplies they could: water bottles, energy bars from limited rations, a few medic all supplies Sarah had managed to collect. "Daniel is organizing the distraction," Marcus informed me. "Small fire in the administration building. Should draw security attention without causing real danger." I nodded. "Once we're out, we head for the commercial district to the east. More places to hide, potential resources, and farther from military control points." "And then what?" James asked, speaking for the first time. The chemistry teacher had been quiet during planning, but his commitment to bringing the treatment information out had been immediate and unquestioning. "Then we find others who can help reproduce the treatment, build connections between survivor groups, create alternatives to the official response." Sarah checked her watch. "Almost time. The guard rotation should happen in about 10 minutes. We positioned ourselves near the service gate, concealed behind maintenance equipment. The gate itself was simple, a chain-link section in the perimeter fence with a padlocked gate for supply deliveries. 2 guards stood watch, looking bored and inattentive. They weren't expecting trouble from inside the containment area. As we waited, I thought about the people we were leaving behind. Daniel and the others from the school, the confused evacuees who didn't understand why they had been separated from colleagues with blue wristbands, all deemed expendable by a system that had predetermined their value. The emergency alarm sounded precisely on schedule, Daniel's distraction taking effect. The guards at our gate immediately tensed, radio crackling with reports of a fire in the administration building. One guard remained at position, while the other moved to investigate. "Now," Marcus whispered, "before reinforcements arrive." While the remaining guard was distracted by radio communications, I moved quickly to the gate, lockpick tools already in hand. The padlock was basic, designed to keep people out, not in. It yielded to my expertise in seconds. Sarah, James, and Marcus slipped through the opening. I followed, carefully reclosing the gate to delay discovery of our escape. We moved quickly across the athletic fields toward the tree line beyond, staying low and using whatever cover was available. Behind us, the containment facility was in controlled chaos, personnel responding to the fire while maintaining perimeter security. Our absence wouldn't be discovered until morning head count at the earliest. We reached the trees without incident, pausing only briefly to confirm our bearings before pressing onward. The commercial district lay about a mile east, abandoned strip malls and office buildings that might offer temporary shelter and resources. As we moved through the darkened landscape, I was acutely aware of the various dangers surrounding us. The infected roamed more actively at night. Military patrols might be operating in the area, And now, we were fugitives from the official response system, carrying information that contradicted the authorized narrative. Yet, amid these dangers, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the outbreak began: purpose. We weren't just running for survival now, we were fighting for something larger. The principle that all lives had value, not just those deemed genetically superior. The weight of the tablet with its crucial research pressed against my chest as we moved through the night. It represented the possibility of a different path forward, one where survival wasn't determined by genetics alone, where the response to catastrophe brought out humanity's best instincts rather than its worst. We had escaped the containment area, but our journey was just beginning, finding allies, reproducing the treatment, establishing networks of survivors outside military control. These challenges loomed ahead of us, and beyond them, the larger questions of who had engineered this apocalypse and why. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as we reached the abandoned commercial district. The first 48 hours of the outbreak had transformed me from a prison locksmith focused on containment to someone dedicated to breaking barriers between those deemed worthy of saving and those written off. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my career building systems to keep people contained. Now I would use those same skills to free as many as possible from the containment structures being imposed upon them. Dawn was approaching, not just of a new day, but of a new phase in this engineered apocalypse. And we would face it with the most dangerous weapon of all: hope that wasn't authorized by those who had planned this nightmare. The commercial district seemed abandoned at first glance, but experience had taught me to look deeper. Signs of life were subtle but present. A window hastily covered with cardboard, a door barricaded from the inside rather than outside, fresh scuff marks on pavement where supplies had been dragged. "People are still here," I murmured to the others as we moved cautiously between abandoned storefronts. "Staying hidden." Marcus nodded, his police training making him equally observant. Smart ones would avoid military contact completely. No way to know which survivors get blue bands and which get red until it's too late. We needed shelter to rest and plan our next moves. I suggested a small office building set back from the main street, less obvious than retail spaces that would have already been picked clean, and potentially containing useful resources. The building's main entrance was locked, but the emergency exit at the rear had been forced open previously. We slipped inside, moving cautiously through darkened hallways. The interior showed signs of hasty abandonment. Personal items left behind, computers still on desks, half-empty coffee cups long since gone cold. We secured a small suite of offices on the second floor, barricading the main entrance and setting up observation points at the windows. The location gave us good visibility of the surrounding area, while keeping us hidden from street level. As the others organized our limited supplies, Sarah examined the research data on the tablet more thoroughly. "This is genuinely groundbreaking," she said after a while, looking up with renewed hope. "The treatment approach is unorthodox, but theoretically sound. It doesn't prevent infection, but it dramatically slows the neural deterioration that leads to loss of cognitive function." "Can it be reproduced with limited resources?" I asked. James, the chemistry teacher, had been reading over her shoulder. "The core compound requires specialized equipment, but there's a modified version here that uses more commonly available materials. Reduced efficacy, but still significant. With the right supplies, we might be able to produce a rudimentary version." It wasn't a cure, but it was something concrete, a way to fight back against the engineered apocalypse. If we could produce even a limited form of the treatment, we could help people maintain their humanity longer after infection, giving more time for a true cure to be developed. But first, we needed to establish our situation and locate allies. I tried using doctors, Chen's communication device, hoping to re-establish contact, but received no response. Either she was unable to communicate or something had happened to her at the research facility. As morning light strengthened, we took inventory of our resources and challenges. We had escaped the containment facility with the research data, but we were now effectively fugitives from the military response system. We had knowledge that contradicted the official narrative, making us dangerous to those implementing the Osiris protocol. "We need to find other survivors," Marcus said, ever practical. "People outside the military containment system. Build a network." Sarah nodded. "And we need medical supplies, pharmaceutical materials, if we're going to produce even the simplified version of this treatment." Local hospitals will be either military-controlled or overrun with infected, I noted. But smaller clinics, veterinary offices, research labs at local schools, those might have been overlooked in the initial response. James studied a map of the area we'd found in the office. There's a community college about a mile north. Science building might have what we need for basic production. It was a start. We decided to rest through the morning hours when infected seemed less active, then moved toward the community college in the afternoon. During the downtime, Sarah and James continued studying the research data, identifying essential components for the treatment and potential substitutes for harder-to-find ingredients. Around midday, we were startled by sounds of movement in the building below us. Someone else was here. Marcus and I moved silently to defensive positions, while Sarah and James gathered our essential supplies in case we needed to evacuate quickly. The footsteps were cautious, methodical, not the shambling gait of infected. Human survivors, moving with purpose. I signaled to Marcus to hold position as I crept toward the stairwell to better assess the situation. Through a crack in the door, I could see 3 people moving through the first floor, 2 men and a woman, armed with improvised weapons and carrying backpacks. They were clearing rooms systematically, gathering supplies. Experienced scavengers, not random survivors. I had to make a quick decision, reveal ourselves or remain hidden. These people could be potential allies, or they could be threats. In this new world, trust was a luxury few could afford. Something about their organized movement tilted my decision. These weren't desperate looters, but disciplined survivors with a system. I opened the door slightly and called down. "We're up here, 4 of us. Not infected, not military." They froze instantly, weapons raised toward my voice. "Show yourself," one man called back. "Slowly." I stepped into view at the top of the stairs, hands visible. "Just looking for shelter, same as you." The woman studied me intently. "You're from the containment facility, red wristband." She pointed to the band I'd forgotten to remove. "We left this morning," I confirmed, deciding honesty was the best approach. The military is separating survivors based on blood tests. Those without a specific genetic marker are being placed in under-resourced containment zones. The 3 exchanged glances that suggested this confirmed something they already suspected. The older man, clearly their leader, nodded. "We've been watching the evacuation patterns. Selective extraction, not random." The woman lowered her weapon slightly. "I'm Elena. This is Ray and Connor. We were hospital staff before everything collapsed. Been avoiding military contact since we saw how they were prioritizing survivors." I introduced myself and explained our small group had information about the infection and a potential treatment that could help those without natural resistance. This piqued their interest immediately. "You better come down and talk," Ray said. "We've got a network you should know about." The tension eased as our groups merged. I called the others down, and we shared information openly. Elena, Ray, and Connor were part of a loose coalition of medical personnel who had recognized something wrong in the official response and chosen to operate independently. "We started noticing patterns on day 1, Elena explained. She had been an emergency room nurse at a small community hospital. Certain patients being evacuated immediately by military personnel, others being left behind with minimal care. When we questioned it, we were told it was triage protocol based on infection risk assessment. Ray, a hospital administrator, had accessed restricted files before systems went down. The protocols were already in place before the outbreak was publicly acknowledged. Pre-planned response based on genetic screening. When I raised concerns with the military medical liaison, I was removed from the communication chain. That's when we decided to go off-grid. They had established a small network of medical professionals and other survivors operating outside official channels. Using abandoned buildings and overlooked resources, they were providing care to those who had either escaped containment or never entered the official response system. "We have maybe 60 people in various locations," Connor explained. "Small groups, staying mobile, sharing resources, medical personnel, some with research backgrounds, people who might be able to help with your treatment data." This was exactly the type of alliance we needed. I shared what we knew about the Osiris Protocol, the engineered nature of the outbreak, and the experimental treatment. Sarah and James provided the technical details that the medical professionals immediately grasped the significance of. "If this works, it changes everything," Elena said. even if it just buys time rather than curing the infection. Ray was more cautious. The military will consider this information highly restricted. Anyone producing unauthorized treatments will be targeted. They already wrote us off with these. I held up my red wristband. What more can they do? The grim answer hung unspoken. Containment wasn't the worst fate the architects of this engineered apocalypse could devise for those who threatened their designed order. We agreed to move to their current base of operations, a former urgent care clinic that had been overlooked in the chaos of the initial outbreak. It had basic medical supplies and, crucially, some laboratory equipment that might be useful for producing the simplified treatment. Before leaving, we scavenged what useful supplies we could from the office building. Professional habits die hard. I found myself examining the building's security features, mentally noting weaknesses and strengths as if preparing a consultation report. Ray noticed my attention to the security aspects. "You have experience with this?" "I was a prison security system specialist," I explained. "Designed and implemented containment protocols for federal facilities." His eyebrows raised. "That's an interesting background for someone now breaking out of containment zones. Ironic, isn't it? I spent my career building systems to keep people locked away. Now, I'm using that knowledge to help people escape. We could use that expertise," he said thoughtfully. "Our locations need better security against both infected and military patrols." By mid-afternoon, we were moving through the commercial district toward the urgent care clinic. We traveled as inconspicuously as possible, avoiding open spaces and maintaining awareness of our surroundings. The infected were present but scattered during daylight hours, making movement possible with proper caution. The urgent care facility was well chosen, set back from the main road, partially hidden by landscaping with limited entry points that could be secured. As we approached, I could see they had implemented basic security measures, barricaded windows, reinforced doors, lookout positions. We were challenged at the perimeter by watchful survivors, then escorted inside once our identities were confirmed. The interior had been converted into a combination living space, medical facility, and research area. About 20 people were present, most wearing the exhausted but determined expression that had become the hallmark of those fighting to maintain humanity in the face of collapse. Dr. Maya Richards, a virologist who had been doing research at a local biotech firm, took immediate interest in the treatment data. She and Sarah huddled over the tablet, engaged in rapid technical discussion that the rest of us could barely follow. While they analyzed the research, I worked with Ray to assess and improve the facility's security. My experience with containment systems proved valuable. I identified vulnerabilities and suggested modifications that would make the location more defensible against both infected and potential military incursions. "The military isn't actively hunting survivors outside containment yet," Ray noted as we reinforced a side entrance. "They're focused on extracting those with the resistance marker and establishing their green zones. But once that's complete, who knows what Phase 2 really entails?" "Controlled abandonment of the rest, if what we learned is accurate," I replied. "But knowledge of the treatment might force them to change that calculation. If people without the marker can survive infection longer, maintain cognitive function, potentially organize, makes us a threat to their designed order," Ray finished. "All the more reason to strengthen our position and expand the network." By evening, Dr. Richards had reached a preliminary conclusion about the treatment data. She gathered our growing group of leaders to share her assessment. "The research is legitimate and promising," she began. "The treatment attacks the pathogen's ability to overtake the central nervous system, significantly slowing deterioration of cognitive function after infection. It doesn't prevent eventual turning, but extends the window of humanity from hours to potentially days." "Can we produce it here?" I asked. "A simplified version, yes, with the right materials. The urgent care has some of what we need, but will require additional supplies from other medical facilities or laboratories." James, our chemistry teacher, had been working with Dr. Richards. "We've identified a community college chemistry lab and a veterinary clinic that might have the remaining components. With those, we could begin small-scale production within days." The possibility energized everyone. This wasn't just survival. It was resistance against a system that had predetermined who deserved to live based on genetics alone. We organized into teams, one to secure the additional supplies needed for treatment production, another to strengthen our defensive position, and a third to establish communication with other survivor groups outside military control. I would lead the supply team, using my security expertise to access the locked facilities we needed to raid. Sarah would remain with Dr. Richards to prepare for treatment production. Marcus would coordinate defense improvements with Ray. James would work with Elena to identify potential substitutes for harder-to-find components. As night fell, I found myself on the roof of the urgent care, taking a rare moment of solitude to process everything that had happened in the past 48 hours. The city sprawled before me, large sections dark due to power failures, others illuminated by military operations or fires still burning unchecked. From this vantage point, I could see the University Medical Center in the distance, still operational with generator power, surrounded by military vehicles. Further away, the secondary containment facility we had escaped from showed minimal lighting, evidence of the limited resources allocated to those deemed expendable. The contrast illustrated the divided world being created through the Osiris Protocol, islands of protected privilege surrounded by darkness where the genetically unworthy had been left to their fate. Dr. Richards joined me on the roof, following my gaze toward the divided city. "You're thinking about the people still in containment," she said. It wasn't a question. "Friends who helped me survive the initial outbreak," I confirmed, "and hundreds of others who don't understand why they've been separated from colleagues, friends, family members with blue wristbands. If we can produce the treatment in sufficient quantities, we might be able to help them," she offered. "Create our own extraction teams, bring more people into the network." "It's not just about saving individuals," I replied. "It's about rejecting the entire framework of the Osiris Protocol, the idea that some lives are inherently more valuable than others based on genetics." She nodded soberly. "What you've uncovered suggests this was never about saving as many as possible. It was about selecting who would comprise the new world after the outbreak runs its course." The implications were staggering, not just a response to a crisis, but a deliberate reshaping of human society through engineered apocalypse. How do we fight something that extensive? I wondered aloud. If this was planned at the highest levels, with pharmaceutical companies and military involvement, we start small, we produce the treatment, we save who we can, we build networks, we share information. She gestured toward the scattered lights visible in different parts of the city. Not everyone is following the official response. There are other groups like ours forming independently. Together, we might be enough to create an alternative. Her words resonated with something that had been forming in my mind since escaping the containment facility. The architects of the Osiris Protocol had designed a system based on control, containment, and selection. Our resistance needed to embody the opposite: connection, freedom, and inclusion. "We need to document everything," I said. "The evidence of engineering, the resistance marker, the treatment research, the containment protocols. Create records that can't be erased or denied later." Dr. Richards understood immediately. "Create accountability for when this is over. Ensure those responsible can't simply claim they were responding to a natural disaster. And give people hope now," I added. "Knowledge is power. If survivors understand what's happening, they can make informed choices rather than blindly trusting a system designed to sacrifice them." As our conversation concluded, I realized the first 48 hours of this outbreak had transformed me in ways I couldn't have imagined. I'd entered it as a security specialist focused on containment protocols. I was emerging as something entirely different, someone dedicated to breaking the very containment systems being imposed on humanity. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. The skills I'd developed to keep people locked away were now my greatest assets in helping people escape. My understanding of how security systems worked made me uniquely qualified to subvert them. The next morning, our supply team prepared for the crucial mission to gather materials needed for treatment production. As I checked our gear and reviewed the plan, I thought about the journey that had brought me here, from Gateway Hospital to military facility to containment center to this independent resistance, all in the span of just 2 days. The zombie outbreak that had seemed like a chaotic natural disaster now revealed itself as something far more sinister, a planned restructuring of society using an engineered pathogen as the sorting mechanism. But in their calculation, the architects of this apocalypse had made one critical error. They had underestimated the human capacity for resistance, for cooperation outside their controlled systems. They had created a containment protocol for our bodies, but they couldn't contain the spread of information, of hope, of the fundamental belief that all lives had value regardless of genetic makeup. As we moved out on our supply mission, I carried not just tools for breaking physical locks, but the key to something more powerful, an alternative vision for survival that rejected the predetermined winners and losers of this engineered apocalypse. The first 48 hours had been about personal survival. Everything that followed would be about something larger, ensuring that humanity survived not just physically, but morally, that when the infection eventually burned itself out, what remained wasn't a society built on selective abandonment, but one forged through collective resistance against those who had tried to play God with our species' future. The prison locksmith who had once secured containment was now dedicated to breaking it open, not just for myself, but for everyone deemed unworthy of salvation by those who had engineered our apocalypse.